The void between realities did not offer the luxury of peace. For Broly, existence had always been measured in violent ruptures, the tearing of flesh, the shrieking collapse of mountain ranges, the blinding green fury that boiled behind his eyelids until thought dissolved into instinct. His last memory was a swirling vortex of iridescent dimensional glass shattering beneath the absolute, merciless pressure of Super Saiyan Blue Gogeta's final assault. Then came the fall, an infinite, cold drop through silent static where space folded inward, crushing his lungs and stripping the golden-green armor of his aura until only the raw, biological core of a Saiyan remained. He broke through the upper atmosphere of a strange Earth not with the measured grace of a flying entity, but as a kinetic meteor. The sky above the sprawling, arid wilderness of the American Southwest split apart with a sound like tearing metal. A streak of friction-ignited emerald fire pierced the cloud deck at Mach 25. The sonic boom flattened miles of scrub brush before the impact even registered. When the body struck the Earth, the kinetic energy excavated a crater 200 meters wide and 40 meters deep, instantly turning tons of sand and bedrock into boiling, vitrified glass. Silence fell over the desert, thick and suffocating. Deep inside the molten epicenter of the crater, a hand moved. It was massive, calloused, scarred by decades of survival on the unforgiving world of Vampa. Fingers dug into the superheated slag, not caring about the 3,000-degree thermal heat. Broly pushed himself upward. His breathing was heavy, ragged, dragging in air that tasted sharply different from the thin, bitter atmosphere of his exile. This world was dense with nitrogen, heavy with the scent of pine, industrial smog carried on distant winds, and unfiltered moisture. He knelt in the smoking glass pit, his broad shoulders rising and falling. His dark hair was matted with sweat and dried blood, falling haphazardly across his face. Around his waist, the pelt of Ba, the green, coarse ear of the beast that had been his only friend, was singed but intact. Broly reached down with trembling, thick fingers, his touch uncharacteristically gentle as he adjusted the pelt against his hip. "Ba," he rasped, his vocal cords dry and cracked from disuse. He had no scouter, no communicator, no presence of Chilai or Limo. There was only a crushing, hollow silence, followed by an immediate biological realization. His body was starving. The Saiyan metabolism, kicked into hyperdrive by the catastrophic trauma of dimensional displacement, demanded thousands of calories immediately. His stomach cramped violently, a sharp internal spike of pain that made his jaw clench until his molars groaned. He stood to his full height, a towering, muscled frame that radiated a subtle, rhythmic thrum of latent kinetic energy. He looked down at his palms. The power inside him was not gone. It sat just beneath his ribs, coiled like a caged predator, sluggish from the dimensional breach, but pulsing with a terrifying, rhythmic beat. Every breath sent small, emerald microsparks jumping across his knuckles. Miles above the desert floor, an orbital surveillance satellite belonging to the Global Defense Agency snapped 30 high-resolution thermal captures in 3 seconds. Inside the subterranean command hub of the Global Defense Agency, red flashing telemetry banners cut across the main holographic display. Cecil Stedman did not flinch. He stood with his hands locked behind his back, the scars along his neck pulling tight as his eyes tracked the seismic readings originating from Sector 4. "Report," Cecil ordered, his voice flat, gravelly, and entirely stripped of panic. A technician rapidly typed across a curved glass interface. "Impact detected 70 miles north of the Nevada Test Range, Director. Trajectory was nearly vertical. Initial telemetry flagged it as an orbital debris strike, but the deceleration profile makes no sense. It didn't burn up. The seismic yield matches a low-yield tactical nuclear detonation, but there's zero radiation." "Satellite imagery," Cecil commanded. The main wall screen shifted, zooming through atmospheric layers until the smoking crater resolved into high-definition clarity. The heat signatures were off the charts, pure white thermal bloom at the center. But as the thermal filters adjusted, the heat cleared to reveal a single, humanoid silhouette climbing over the jagged rim of the crater. "Is it a Flaxen Vanguard?" an analyst asked from the pit. "Negative," Cecil replied, leaning closer to the terminal. No spatial portal signatures, no tachyon bleed, just a body falling from orbit and walking away from the blast radius. He tapped the comms unit lodged behind his right ear. "Get me the Guardians. If they're tied up, patched directly to Omni-Man. Tell him we have an unregistered Class 10 asset on the ground in the Mojave and it's mobile." "Director," the technician interrupted, voice dropping an octave. "Look at the local barometric pressure around the target. It's fluctuating. The ambient temperature around the subject is dropping while the kinetic output is rising." On the screen, the giant had stopped walking. He was looking straight up, not at the sky generally, but directly into the orbital satellite's optical vector, as if he could feel the faint electric ping of the lens locking onto him from 300 miles in space. Cecil's jaw tightened. "Scramble the cloaked rapid response units. Nobody engages until we know what species we're dealing with, and get Donald down here right now." On the surface, Broly lowered his gaze from the sky. The sky felt watched. In his previous life, he had known the cold gaze of King Cold's empire, the mechanical pinging of Saiyan pods, and the clinical tracking of Frieza's reconnaissance drones. This world had that same greasy, invisible surveillance layered over the atmosphere. He took a step forward, his boots crushing desert rocks into powder. With every step, the hunger clawed deeper into his gut. A sudden hum vibrated through the air. 3 high-altitude tactical gunships, wrapped in active optical camouflage, phased into partial visibility 500 feet above the canyon floor. Their jet turbines whined as they banked, surrounding the giant. Automated megaphones deployed from their hulls, a synthetic voice echoing across the desert expanse. "Unidentified entity. You are in restricted United States airspace and trespassing on Global Defense Agency property. Do not move. Place your hands behind your head and submit to quarantine containment protocols." Broly did not understand the language entirely, but he understood the tone. It was the tone of the shock collars Paragus used to fit around his neck. It was the voice of captors holding a whip just out of sight. His dark eyes narrowed. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, so deep that the pebbles at his feet began to bounce and rattle. "Stay away," Broly warned, his voice low, sounding like 2 tectonic plates grinding together. From the lead gunship, 4 heavy-gauge magnetic suppression harpoons were fired simultaneously. The steel projectiles hissed through the air, trailing thick, high-voltage tungsten cables designed to subdue enhanced superhumans with 100,000 volts of continuous current. 2 harpoons struck Broly directly in the chest. The other 2 pierced his shoulder and thigh. The steel tips did not penetrate. They hit his dense, high-gravity-conditioned Saiyan skin and flattened with a dull clunk, their tungsten tips shattering like glass against an anvil. The electrical current surged instantly, wrapping his muscular frame in violent blue arcs of artificial lightning. Broly didn't even twitch. The electricity tickled his skin, doing nothing more than irritating the deep-seated instincts of a warrior who had bathed in the acid storms of Vampa. Inside the cockpit of the lead GDA gunship, the pilot stared at his readouts in horror. Harpoons failed, target skin density is off the scale, voltage output is having 0 effect, repeat, 0 neuromuscular disruption. Broly grabbed the thick tungsten cables in his left hand. "I said," Broly's voice dropped, dropping into a register that made the air itself turn heavy and thick. "Stay away." With a single, effortless flick of his forearm, Broly ripped the cables downward. The physics were incomprehensible to the GDA pilots. The 40-ton gunship was hauled out of the sky as if it were a child's kite caught in a hurricane. It slammed violently into the second gunship with a deafening crash of tearing aluminum and exploding jet fuel. The 2 crafts spun out of control, crashing into the canyon wall in a blooming fireball of orange flame and black smoke. The third gunship immediately aborted, firing its afterburners to retreat, its thrusters screaming as it pulled straight up toward the cloud layer. Broly didn't move from his spot. He simply raised his right hand, cupping his palm slightly. A sphere of pure, incandescent emerald the size of a marble materialized above his fingertips. It didn't make a sound. It simply radiated a gravitational pressure so intense that the sand beneath his feet was instantly vaporized into clean, empty space. With a casual flick of his wrist, he launched the sphere upward. The Kai blast crossed 3 miles of sky in a fraction of a microsecond. When it struck the retreating gunship, there was no standard explosion. The vessel, the armor, the fuel, and the air surrounding it were erased in a dome of blinding green light that expanded for 2 miles across the upper atmosphere before collapsing into absolute nothingness. The sky was left completely clear of clouds, scorched clean by the sheer thermal and spiritual pressure of the attack. Broly lowered his hand. His chest heaved slightly, his eyes flashing with a dangerous yellow ring around the irises, the first warning sign of the Uzaru power stirring within his human form. He stood alone in the silence of the burning desert, the scent of jet fuel and ozone lingering in the air. He had not wanted to fight. He only wanted food, quiet, and safety. But this world was already reaching out with iron claws to grab him. Far to the east, breaking the sound barrier at Mach 50, a red and white streak cut across the sky, heading directly toward the coordinates of the blast. Omni-Man had just entered Nevada airspace. The emerald sphere's afterglow lingered in the upper atmosphere, staining the desert clouds with a faint, radioactive-tinted twilight. Broly stood motionless amidst the glass-melted sand, the acrid scent of vaporized alloys and ozone burning his nostrils. His chest rose and fell in heavy, rhythmic surges. The hunger inside his gut had evolved from a dull ache to a ravenous fire, chewing through his reserves. Across the cracked expanse of the Mojave, the air turned brutally cold. A high-pitched, atmospheric whine preceded the arrival, a compression of air so violent that the sound barrier was shattered not once, but thrice in a single heartbeat. Nolan Grayson descended. Omni-Man didn't crash into the earth like a meteor. He arrested his kinetic momentum inches above the desert floor with the flawless, unnatural control of a Viltrumite conqueror. The displaced air from his sudden deceleration blasted outward, kicking up a ring of pulverized dust that swept past Broly's shins. Nolan hovered 2 feet off the ground, arms folded neatly across his chest, the white cape of his uniform snapping in the synthetic wind of his own aura. His mustache was neatly trimmed, his cold, slate-gray eyes assessing the massive stranger with clinical detachment. To Nolan, Earth was an incubator of fragile, squabbling pests, punctuated occasionally by anomalous metahumans who needed to be categorized, monitored, or quietly eliminated before the Viltrum Empire arrived to harvest the planet. He looked at the smoking debris of the 3 JDA gunships. He looked at the circular trench of vaporized stone where the 3rd vessel had simply ceased to exist. Finally, he looked at Broly. "You made a mess," Omni-Man said. His voice was steady, resonant, carrying the absolute authority of a man who had ripped tectonic plates apart with his bare hands. "Cecil sent 3 tactical teams to contain you. They didn't even have time to report back." Broly didn't speak. His eyes, dark and guarded, locked onto Nolan's hovering form. He had seen beings who flew without wings before, Frieza, the golden-haired warriors on Earth, his father. But this man carried a different kind of pressure. There was no flowing spiritual Kai leaking from him. Instead, Nolan's presence felt like a solid block of dense, dead iron suspended in the sky. "I don't know what rock you crawled out from under," Nolan continued, slowly lowering his boots to touch the desert floor. "But on this world, things are organized. You don't get to vaporize government assets and walk away. Who are you?" "Leave," Broly rasped, his voice tearing out of his dry throat like broken slate. "Just leave." Nolan raised an eyebrow. The arrogance of Earth's native super beings never ceased to amuse him, but this giant's sheer biological mass was atypical. The scars across the stranger's torso were jagged, clearly sustained from claws and high-energy impacts rather than medical surgeries. "That's not an option," Nolan said coldly. He took a single step forward, the ground beneath his boot cracking under the casual resting density of his frame. "You're going to come with me to a GDA containment facility. If you cooperate, they might even figure out a way to feed that massive frame of yours before they lock you in a deep underground vault." The word vault, the promise of a cage, struck the exact nerve Paragus had spent 40 years bruising. A deep, tectonic vibration started in Broly's chest. The air around him shimmered. Small pebbles, fragments of glass, and loose dirt began to levitate, floating upward toward the sky in direct defiance of gravity. The ambient temperature within 50 yards dropped 10 degrees in a fraction of a second, pulled into the vacuum of Broly's awakening bioenergy. "I won't go back in a cage," Broly growled. His broad shoulders broadened further as his trap swelled with surging blood flow. Nolan sighed, a dismissive puff of air leaving his nostrils. They never learn. In less than a microsecond, faster than human neurons could fire an electrical impulse, Omni-Man crossed the 20 yards between them. His right fist was cocked, aimed directly at Broly's jaw with enough force to shatter a mountain range and turn an ordinary superhuman into red mist. Crack! The shockwave carved a trench across the desert, kicking up a 200-foot wall of dust that expanded outward for miles. Nolan's fist had landed leanly on Broly's jaw. Yet Broly's head had only snapped 3 inches to the side. Omni-Man's eyes widened, a microscopic flicker of genuine shock piercing his stoic mask. The resistance he had met was not the yielding flesh of an earthling or the brittle shell of a flaxen soldier. It felt like punching the core of a collapsed neutron star. The kinetic feedback traveled straight up Nolan's arm, vibrating violently in his collarbone. Broly slowly turned his head back to face the Viltrumite. His dark eyes were gone. A faint, fluorescent ring of molten amber yellow burned inside his irises. The Saiyan wrathful state, the primal tapping of the great ape's power within the humanoid frame, was slipping its leash. "Is that all?" Broly whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, layered double tone. Before Nolan could pull his fist back to adjust his striking vector, Broly's left hand shot out. His massive, scarred fingers clamped around Omni-Man's right wrist like a titanium vice. Nolan reacted instantly, attempting to fly backward to use his flight propulsion to tear free, but he couldn't move an inch. Broly's grip was absolute, anchoring him to the spot with incomprehensible raw physical mass. "What are you?" Nolan began, his composure cracking. Broly didn't answer with words. He threw his right fist straight into Omni-Man's solar plexus. The impact sounded like a heavy artillery shell detonating inside a steel vault. The kinetic force bypassed Nolan's dense muscle tissue, rippling straight through his organs and blowing out the back of his white and red tunic in shredded ribbons. The air was violently evacuated from Omni-Man's lungs, spraying a fine mist of crimson Viltrumite blood across Broly's bare, scarred chest. Nolan's eyes bulged. For the first time since he had arrived on Earth decades ago, his ribs had cracked. Broly didn't let go of his wrist. With a primal roar that tore the very clouds above them to pieces, Broly slammed Omni-Man face first into the desert bedrock, lifted him by the arm, and hammered him into the earth 3 more times, creating craters with every strike. Green lightning began to arc violently off Broly's skin, crackling across the scorched earth as the Saiyan's latent battle power began its infinite, exponential climb. Miles away, aboard the GDA orbital satellite, Cecil Stedman dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the metal grate beneath his boots, but his eyes never left the seismic monitors that were screaming into the red. "My God," Cecil whispered into his comms, "Nolan's losing." The Nevada desert was no longer a geographic feature. It was a scorched tectonic scar. Nolan Grayson was airborne not by his own propulsion, but because 300 pounds of hyperdense Saiyan muscle had hurled him 2 miles into the upper troposphere. The Viltrumite spun through the thin air, coughing up thick, dark red blood that froze into crimson hail in the sub-zero atmospheric slipstream. His internal organs burned. 2 of his ribs were splintered, grinding against each other with every ragged intake of oxygen. Below him, the desert floor exploded. Broly did not fly with the smooth, anti-gravitational elegance of a Viltrumite. He moved via pure explosive displacement. The ground beneath his boots shattered into powdery quartz as he launched himself upward like a kinetic kill vehicle. The sonic boom trailed behind him as an emerald vapor cone, tearing the clouds apart in a 4-mile radius. "Die, you arrogant parasite!" Nolan roared, the Viltrumite conqueror's blood screaming over his shock. Nolan righted himself midair, ignited his flight mechanism to maximum thrust, and dove straight back down. 2 living extinction events met at Mach 40 above the desert floor. Boom! The atmospheric shockwave triggered seismic alarms in Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles simultaneously. For half a second, the kinetic energy converted directly into blinding white light. When the flash cleared, Nolan was driving both fists downward onto Broly's skull, and Broly had both forearms raised, catching the double fist hammer strike without yielding a single inch of altitude. The green lightning dancing over Broly's shoulders deepened into a violent, pulsing jade. His hair began to rise, defying gravity, standing on end in jagged black spikes as his muscles swelled by 20%. His irises had fully turned into glowing rings of molten amber. RRAAGGH. Broly grabbed Nolan by the throat with his left hand, crushing the Viltrumite's windpipe until cartilage cracked, then drove his right knee directly into Nolan's sternum. The impact sounded like a cathedral bell collapsing inward. Nolan's eyes rolled back. The sheer, brute force sent him hurtling down like an artillery shell, slamming straight through 400 feet of solid granite and burying him deep beneath the desert crust. Broly hung in the sky, his chest heaving like a forge bellows. Emerald sparks hissed AC. Ross his knuckles, ionizing the air into sharp ozone. His Saiyan biology was reacting to the impact. The faint pain in his forearms was not weakening him. It was unlocking the boundless, terrifying reservoir of the great ape's power. 20 miles out, a sleek, triangular supersonic jet cut through the turbulence. Inside the Teen Team transport, the telemetry screens were lighting up in panic-grade red. Robot sat rigidly at the helm, his mechanical fingers moving with millisecond precision over the console, while Rex Splode paced the narrow aisle, charging kinetic energy into an empty soda can just to burn off adrenaline. "Cecil, what the hell are we flying into?" Rex shouted over the open comms link. "The seismic monitors say somebody just set off 3 tactical nukes in the desert." Cecil Stedman's voice came through the comms, cold, clipped, and strained in a way the Teen Team had never heard before. "You are not engaging in offensive combat. I repeat, Teen Team is strictly on search, rescue, and perimeter containment. Nolan engaged the target 3 minutes ago." "Omni-Man's on it?" Adam Eve leaned forward, adjusting her pink-canned white uniform. "Then why do you need us? Nolan can crack a meteor with his chin." "Nolan's biometric telemetry just dropped out," Cecil answered flatly. "His transponder is 500 feet underground and the target is still airborne. Get Mark on site immediately." Before Eve could reply, the sky outside turned a vivid, sickly green. "Brace," Robot yelled. A low-altitude shockwave hit the jet. The specialized GDA composite armor groaned, the windshield cracking in spiderweb fractures as the aircraft was spun 90 degrees by the sheer ambient pressure wave. Below them, hovering 50 feet above the burning crater, was a giant. He had dark, wild hair that whipped violently around his head, a scarred chest rippling with dense, iron-hard musculature, and a coarse green fur pelt tied around his waist. He was not looking at their weapon systems. He was looking at the energy emissions of the jet's engine cores with primitive, predatory curiosity. "Holy shit," Rex whispered, dropping his charged can. "That's not a metahuman, that's a walking calamity." The side hatch of the transport blew outward, and Invincible, Mark Grayson, shot into the desert air, his blue and yellow suit gleaming against the dust storm. "Hey, back off," Mark yelled, his voice cracking slightly with the teenage adrenaline of a hero still figuring out his limits. He flew toward Broly at maximum velocity, cocking his fist back to deliver the hardest hit of his life. "What did you do to my dad?" Broly didn't flinch. He didn't even shift his stance. Mark's fist struck Broly flush on the left cheek. The resulting kinetic boom blew the dust away for hundreds of yards, but Broly's neck didn't move. Not a millimeter. It felt to Mark like punching the solid steel hull of an aircraft carrier moving at full throttle. The shock broke 3 bones in Mark's right hand, a sickening snap echoing over the comms. "Avarg," Mark gasped, clutching his shattered hand, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief. What are you made of?" Broly looked down at the boy. The glowing yellow rings in his eyes flickered. He didn't see an empire's conqueror. He saw a frail, reckless whelp throwing itself into a meat grinder. "Weak," Broly growled, the double tone in his voice vibrating Mark's eardrums until they bled. Broly slapped him. It was not a martial arts strike. It was an open-handed swat, like a man brushing away a horsefly. Yet the force behind it launched Mark through 3 separate sandstone plateaus, pulverizing 200,000 tons of rock before Mark's limp body came to rest half-buried in a rubble heap 3 miles away. "Mark!" Eve screamed from the transport hatch. Pink energy surged around her hands, forming massive, dense shields of hard light matter and diamond-grade carbon lattices between Broly and the crashed transport. "Robot, fire everything! Buy time!" Robot didn't hesitate. 6 high-yield micromissile pods deployed from the jet's chassis, firing 3 dozen armor-piercing, thermite-tipped projectiles directly into Broly's chest. Boom, 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 boom. A dense cloud of black thermite smoke and white-hot fire enveloped the Saiyan. Rexplode leaped from the hull, hurling a handful of kinetically charged steel ball bearings into the inferno. "Eat that, you giant freak!" The fire didn't clear naturally. It was violently blasted away by a dome of emerald Kai that expanded 50 yards in a fraction of a millisecond. Broly stepped out of the crater. The missiles had not left a scratch. His skin, tempered by the lethal gravity and megafauna of Vampa, had simply absorbed the thermal heat. But the constant attacks, the shrieking sirens, the metal bugs firing needles at his flesh, it was overloading his mind. The image of Paragus holding the remote control flashed behind Broly's eyes. "BZZT. Jacques. BZZT. Pain. RRRAAGGGHH." The ground beneath the teen team liquefied into boiling magma from the sheer thermal runoff of Broly's aura. The emerald light around him erupted into a pillar of pure Kai that pierced through the stratosphere, visible from the International Space Station as a brilliant green beacon on Earth's night side. Robot's internal diagnostics began throwing fatal error codes. "Warning, energy reading exceeds measurable limits. Eve, abort. We cannot survive a direct hit from." Before Robot could finish, the ground 50 yards away exploded in a shower of obsidian rock. Omni-Man burst from the subterranean depths, his costume half-shredded, covered in his own blood, his eyes burning with pure, murderous Viltrumite rage. He wasn't playing the protector of Earth anymore. His true nature had broken through. "You die here, beast!" Nolan screamed, flying at Broly with his hands formed into spear tips, aimed to decapitate the Saiyan in one clean pass. Broly turned his glowing amber eyes toward the incoming Viltrumite, baring his teeth in a terrifying, feral grin. "Come," Broly roared. The air between the 2 powerhouses ceased to exist. Omni-Man's spear hand strike tore through the sound barrier, compressing atmospheric gases into a blade of superheated plasma that cleaved the desert bedrock. His target was Broly's jugular, a clean, surgical decapitation to restore the undisputed supremacy of the Viltrum Empire. Broly did not dodge. He lunged forward to meet the execution stroke. Clang! The impact was not the wet sound of tearing flesh. It was the deafening shriek of high-yield steel colliding at orbital velocities. Nolan's hardened, diamond-density fingers struck Broly's trapezius muscle and bent backward with a sickening snap. 2 of Nolan's fingers dislocated at the knuckles, the force of his own kinetic momentum rebounding violently through his skeletal frame. Before Nolan could register the agony, Broly's left arm whipped around like a steel girder, hooking the Viltrumite across the jaw. Crack! Teeth and crimson droplets scattered across the glass-scorched earth. Nolan's vision whited out. The world spun into a blur of burning sand and jade-colored sky. Broly didn't let him drift. He grabbed Nolan by the back of his white-hand red tunic, hauled him back into striking range, and drove a savage, piston-like right hook directly into Nolan's exposed ribs. THOOM. The shockwave blasted the teen team's grounded transport another 100 yards backward, flipping the multi-million-dollar craft onto its side like an empty soda can. Inside the wreckage, Rex Splode pulled himself through the mangled hatch, spitting blood and dust. "Eve, get us out of here. The old man is getting slaughtered." "I can't leave Mark," Eve cried, her hands glowing with brilliant pink energy as she erected 3 concentric hexagonal barrier domes over the unconscious, bloodied teenager 50 yards away. "Cecil, do you copy? Mark has multiple compound fractures. Nolan's losing." Over the scrambled, static-heavy frequency, Cecil Stedman's voice cut through with razor-sharp urgency. "Evacuate the area immediately. We are authorizing the quantum disruption satellite. You have 20 seconds to clear the strike zone." 20 seconds, Rex shrieked. "Robot, move your titanium ass." Robot dragged himself from the shattered cockpit, his chassis sparking where a kinetic shockwave had severed the hydraulics in his left leg. "Negative. We cannot outrun an orbital-grade particle strike on foot. Our only survival vector is the shelter of Eve's molecular shielding." In the center of the crater, the battle reached a fever pitch. Nolan, fueled by the sheer survival instinct that made Viltrumites the terror of the cosmos, gouged his remaining good hand into Broly's eye sockets. He thumbed hard, aiming to pop the Saiyan's eyeballs like grapes. Broly didn't scream in fear. He roared in pure, unadulterated fury. The emerald aura around Broly flared violently, expanding outward in a razor-sharp shockwave of raw Kai that stripped the skin from Nolan's knuckles and seared his forearms down to raw muscle. Broly clamped his massive hands onto both sides of Nolan's skull, planting his boots into the molten stone. "You hurt, like them?" Broly snorted, hot green steam pouring from his nostrils. "You all try to break me." Broly headbutted him. Kaboom! The collision was audible across 3 state lines. Nolan's nose shattered into pulverized cartilage. Blood poured down his lips and chin as his eyes rolled completely back into his head, his consciousness flickering like a dying candle. Broly raised the Viltrumite high above his head, muscles swelling until his scarred green pelt strained against his waist. He prepared to snap Nolan's spine across his knee. High in low Earth orbit, the Global Defense Agency's primary killsat locked its targeting reticle onto Broly's coordinates. Firing in 3, T. Woes 1. A pillar of pure, coherent antimatter-infused laser energy, 4 meters wide, dropped from the heavens at light speed. It struck Broly dead center. The desert floor vanished in a silent, blinding flash of absolute white. A column of raw energy bored straight down, melting bedrock into a subterranean shaft 3,000 feet deep. The seismic force registered as a magnitude 7.2 earthquake, collapsing canyon walls for miles around and superheating the air, until the sand turned into a boiling, bubbling lake of emerald glass. When the orbital beam finally cut out, total silence fell over the wasteland. Eve's pink shields shattered under the residual thermal shockwave, throwing her, Robot, and Rex across the scorched earth. Coughing, she pushed herself up, looking toward the smoldering, bottomless trench. Nolan lay 50 yards away, crumpled like a broken ragdoll in a pool of his own blood, breathing in shallow, wet gasps. At the edge of the pit, standing entirely unscathed amidst the radioactive steam, was Broly. The blast had not torn him apart. It had only vaporized the upper half of his shredded black undershirt, revealing the full, terrifying tapestry of scars across his massive chest. His hair was completely standing on end, crackling with violent jade lightning that hissed through the air. The molten yellow rings in his eyes burned with an insatiable, world-ending hunger for battle. He looked down at his own smoking palms, then turned his gaze straight up into the clear blue sky toward the invisible satellite orbiting Earth. Broly opened his mouth, and a beam of concentrated emerald Kai tore out from his throat, screaming upward into the void of space. 3 seconds later, 800 miles above Earth, The GDA's $50 billion orbital superweapon exploded into a silent, expanding ring of green stardust. The silence following the destruction of the orbital satellite was heavier than the desert heat. Above the smoking trench, the sky was an immaculate, cloudless azure stripped clean of atmosphere by Broly's Kai cannon. 800 miles above, metal wreckage and shattered solar arrays from the multi-billion-dollar GDA Killsat tumbled silently through low orbit, burning up upon re-entry as faint green-tinted shooting stars. On the ground, Broly exhaled. The breath leaving his lips looked like superheated emerald vapor. His muscles twitched with a strange, violent euphoria. The Saiyan genetic code was a biological feedback loop. Trauma did not break the structure. It recalibrated the organism to operate at an order of magnitude higher. The orbital laser had not pierced his epidermal layer, but the kinetic pressure had forced his dormant Kai reservoirs to tear open wider. His power was no longer just pooling beneath his ribs. It was a roaring furnace spilling outward into the surrounding ecosystem. A groan rose from the smoldering glass 30 yards away. Nolan Grayson rolled onto his stomach, spitting a clot of dark, purple-tinged blood onto the vitrified quartz. His white-hand red tunic was entirely torn across the torso, exposing shattered ribs that were slowly, agonizingly clicking back into alignment under the relentless drive of Viltrumite's cellular regeneration. His right arm hung loosely from a broken collarbone. "You mongrel," Nolan rasped, pushing himself up with his left arm. His vision was doubled, swimming in a red haze of concussion and absolute humiliated fury. A savage on a world of worms. Broly turned, his molten amber eyes locked onto the struggling Viltrumite. He didn't speak. He stepped forward, his boots crunching over the cooling slag. Each step sent a deep, rhythmic tremor through the bedrock. To Broly, Nolan was no longer an incomprehensible alien flying through the sky. He was an aggressive predator that refused to stay down, a beast on Vampa that needed to be put into the dirt before it bit again. "Cecil," Nolan growled into the crushed remnants of his subdermal comlink, his voice trembling with an emotion he hadn't felt in 500 years, desperation. "Teleport me out now." "Telemetry locked," Cecil's voice sounded thin and strained through the scrambled receiver. "Donald, pull the kids first." A flash of bright blue light enveloped the downed Teen Team transport 50 yards away. Eve, Rex, Robot, and the unconscious, mangled body of Mark Grayson vanished in an instantaneous quantum displacement blink, leaving behind only the scorched outline of their boots. A second blue flash enveloped Nolan. Broly moved. He broke the sound barrier from a dead standstill, crossing the distance with a speed that defied basic mass mechanics. His massive hand shot through the glowing blue teleportation matrix just as it materialized around Nolan's neck. The spatial tether violently snapped. Inside the subterranean GDA command bunker beneath the Pentagon, 3 primary quantum capacitors exploded in showers of white. Hot sparks. Donald dropped to the floor as an electrical arc ripped through the main routing console, burning out the teleportation grid's stabilization nodes. "Director," Donald yelled, wiping smoke from his scorched cheek. The target intercepted the quantum field. He anchored Nolan's mass through brute spatial disruption. The teleport didn't pull Nolan out, it almost pulled the facility to him. Cecil Stedman gripped the railing of the command catwalk so hard the metal groaned. His scarred face was deathly pale. "Reroute power to secondary dampeners. Disconnect the pad. We can't save him if that monster piggybacks the signal into this bunker." Back in the desert, the blue light shattered like brittle glass. Broly's fingers were buried deep into Nolan's throat, cutting off the Viltrumite's air supply entirely. He lifted Omni-Man 5 feet off the ground, holding him aloft like a broken banner. Nolan's face turned deep crimson, veins bulging across his forehead as he hammered his remaining good fist into Broly's forearm. Crack, crack, crack. The strikes landed with the force of bunker-busting artillery, but Broly's arm didn't flinch. The green aura shielding the Saiyan's skin simply absorbed the kinetic transfer, converting the raw force into more ambient heat. "Why do you fight?" Broly growled, his voice deep, vibrating with the terrifying, resonant echo of the great ape. I wanted food, I wanted quiet. Nolan choked, blood spilling past his teeth. You are a disease to the Empire when Thrag finds this world. You will be eradicated. Broly's brow furrowed. He didn't know who Thrag was, but the tone of absolute entitlement was identical to King Vegeta's decrees. The cold arrogance of rulers who threw infants onto death worlds because they feared what was written in the stars. No, Broly said simply. He raised his free fist, pulling it back. A dense, crackling sphere of pure jade Kai ignited around his knuckles, condensing until it was the size of a golf ball, radiating enough energy to bore through the planet's mantle. Before the execution blow could land, the desert sky 300 feet above them tore wide open. The sound was not an explosion. It was the high-pitched shriek of folding spacetime. A massive, geometric tear appeared in the atmosphere, a glowing, blood-red rift spanning half a mile across. The sky bled an unnatural crimson hue over the Nevada flats as the temporal barrier between dimensions collapsed. From the rift, massive, bronze-plated war dreadnoughts began to pour forth. The Flaxans had returned. Having experienced centuries of military evolution and technological advancement within their alternate, hyper-accelerated time stream, the Flaxan Empire had mobilized an armada specifically calibrated to conquer Earth. Thousands of mechanized shock troopers in heavy, antimatter-plated exoskeletons surged out of the rift on grav-skiffs, flanked by walking siegewalkers that bristled with tachyon beam cannons and temporal disruption mortars. Subjugate the native primitives, the Flaxan Supreme Commander's voice boomed through giant aerial loudspeakers, translating into synthesized English. The Viltrumite Protector is crippled. Harvest this timeline. A barrage of thousands of high-yield temporal energy beams rained down from the sky, blanket bombing the entire 5-mile radius of the desert. The blasts were designed to age biological matter to dust in seconds while vaporizing armored targets. The barrage struck Broly and Nolan simultaneously. The sheer volume of the explosive bombardment kicked up a massive cloud of radioactive red dust, tearing Nolan from Broly's grip and hurling the Viltrumite 100 yards away into a ditch of crushed stone. Nolan lay motionless, his consciousness finally giving out under the combined trauma of Viltrumite-breaking trauma and heavy artillery fire. Broly stood at the center of the Flaxan strike zone. The tachyon beams struck his bare chest, his arms, his face. The temporal disruption fields attempted to age his cells, to strip his youth and rot his muscle tissue into withered ash. Instead, the Saiyan genome reacted with pure, unmitigated evolutionary defiance. The pressure of an entire interdimensional empire raining artillery onto his flesh did not wither Broly. It shattered the final restraint, holding back his wrathful state. A pillar of pure, apocalyptic emerald energy erupted from Broly's body, rising 10 miles into the upper atmosphere and parting the Flaxan Rift's crimson clouds. The shockwave alone wiped out the entire first wave of 500 Flaxan shock troopers, disintegrating their high-tech exoskeletons into metallic dust before they could even hit the ground. The two leading Flaxan dreadnoughts were caught in the expanding kinetic sphere, their heavy bronze hulls crumpled inward like aluminum foil under the oceanic pressure of Broly's aura, detonating their internal antimatter cores in a series of chain reaction fireballs. Broly looked up at the invading armada. His hair had surged upward into a towering, jagged mane of pure black fury, crackling with violent jade lightning. The veins across his neck, arms, and chest bulged with an unnatural, radioactive green glow. His pupils had completely vanished, replaced by an abyss of pure, blinding amber gold wrath. The Saiyan took flight. He did not use wings. He did not use thrusters. He detonated the air beneath him, launching his body into the center of the Flaxan fleet at Mach 100. The Flaxan Supreme Commander aboard the central flagship had only 2 seconds to register the incoming trajectory on his holographic sensors. "What is that reading?" the commander screamed, Is it the Viltrumite? Negative, a Flaxen scientist shrieked, clawing at the controls as the consoles melted from ambient radiation. It's not Viltrumite. The energy output is. It's mathematically impossible. It's a localized superno. Boom! Broly punched straight through the flagship's reinforced composite hull, through the engine core, and out the top of the command bridge in a single, unbroken line of kinetic destruction. The 2-mile-long dreadnought split cleanly in half, collapsing into a screaming vortex of burning plasma. Broly hovered in the center of the burning sky, surrounded by thousands of panic-stricken invaders. He threw his arms wide, his chest expanding as he drew in the scorched air of the battlefield. Around him, hundreds of glowing green Kai orbs materialized out of thin air, the eraser cannon volley. Die, Broly roared, his voice shaking the tectonic plates of the North American continent. The green orbs shot outward in every direction, turning the sky into a catastrophic storm of emerald light. Every Flaxen ship, walker, and soldier caught in the barrage was utterly erased from existence, their advanced armor offering no more resistance than dry paper tossed into a furnace. Down in the subterranean bunker, Cecil Stedman watched the live satellite feed of an entire interdimensional army being dismantled in less than 90 seconds by a single, shirtless humanoid. Cecil turned to Donald, his voice shaking with a cold, absolute realization. "Cancel the quarantine protocols," Cecil whispered. "We don't have a cage for him. May God help us if he decides to turn around and look at Washington." The desert air burned like an open blast furnace. High above the Nevada flats, the Flaxen Rift shuddered under the strain of its own failing containment field. The interdimensional gateway, designed to siphon armies across temporal planes, was now choking on the debris of its own vanguard. Severed hulls of bronze dreadnoughts, molten plating, and thousands of fragmented particle rifles rained down like jagged iron hail, vaporizing long before they hit the ground in the thermal wake of Broly's aura. Broly hung suspended in the bleeding crimson sky. The jade lightning crackling off his skin had grown so dense it formed a continuous humming cage of plasma around his torso. His breathing was deep, rhythmic, and terrifyingly calm for a creature exerting the kinetic output of a continental shelf shifting in real time. Every pulse of his heart sent a subsonic wave rolling across the desert, rattling window panes in Las Vegas 300 miles to the east. Inside the Flaxen staging dimension on the other side of the tier, panic had turned into outright hysteria. The Flaxen War Council had spent 2 centuries rebuilding, engineering temporal disruption artillery specifically designed to age the Viltrumite Nolan Grayson into a brittle husk within minutes. They had calculated every vector, every atmospheric variable, and every counteroffensive measure Earth could muster. They had not accounted for a living god of limitless biological rage. Through the shimmering red tier, a second wave tried to retreat. Massive, multi-legged siege crawlers the size of city blocks began reversing their repulsor drives, desperately attempting to seal the portal from the other side. Giant mechanical iris gates along the rift's perimeter began to slide shut, humming with tachyon energy to sever the spatial link. Broly's glowing amber eyes narrowed. The primal instinct running his nervous system recognized only one rule. An enemy that shows teeth must be broken until it can never bear them again. RRAAGH. Broly didn't let them close the door. He shot forward, breaking the sound barrier instantaneously, and leaving a vacuum tunnel through the clouds that caused a thunderclap loud enough to burst the eardrums of every living thing within 10 square miles. He slammed both hands into the edges of the closing interdimensional rift. Down in the GDA subterranean bunker, Donald dropped his data tablet. "Director, he's grabbing the portal." "That's a localized wormhole, Donald," Cecil said, his voice stripped of all emotion, his eyes fixed on. "The impossible telemetry. It's a fold in non-Euclidean spacetime. You can't grab it." Broly didn't care about physics. Green Kai surged down his forearms, solidifying into raw, physicalized mass that coated the temporal tier. With a roar that shook the mantle beneath the continent, Broly pulled his arms outward. Crack shatter. The space-time fabric groaned like snapping cables. Broly literally tore the interdimensional rift wide open, using his bare hands and the sheer spiritual density of his Kai to rip the portal 40% wider than its designed structural limits. He looked through the tier into the flaxen homeworld, a sprawling, hyper-advanced metropolis of towering bronze spires, temporal power grids, and billions of armored citizens looking up at the sky in sheer, unadulterated terror. Broly cupped his right hand behind his hip. A single, pinprick spark of green light appeared in his palm. Within a millisecond, it expanded into a pulsating, hyperdense sphere of destructive energy the size of a cathedral dome, an eraser cannon charged with enough planetary-grade Kai to core an asteroid. The light cast long, sickly green shadows across the entire flaxen capital world on the other side of the void. Broly thrust his palm forward. Vanish. The blast didn't just cross the threshold, it erased the threshold entirely. The green beam surged into the flaxen dimension like an unrelenting tidal wave of raw star matter. It plowed straight through the planetary defense grid, through the capital's central temporal spire, and into the crust of their world. A silent, blinding dome of jade light expanded across the other side of the rift for 2 terrifying seconds before the temporal feedback loop ruptured. The portal violently collapsed inward, imploding with a deafening snap that pulled the remaining atmospheric smoke into a micro-singularity before disappearing completely. The flaxen threat was not repelled, it was wiped from the timeline forever. Silence returned to the desert. Broly slowly descended, his boots touching the molten glass of the crater rim. The black spikes of his hair began to lower, settling back into unruly, sweat-drenched locks across his forehead. The golden amber glow in his eyes faded back to deep, dark obsidian. The terrifying, layered double voice quieted as he drew a long, shivering breath of cool night air. He looked down at his trembling, scarred hands. His stomach let out a thunderous, biological roar that echoed off the canyon walls. 30 yards away, half buried under a pile of flaxen scrap metal, Nolan Grayson groaned. The Viltrumite's healing factor had managed to knit his broken collarbone and stop the internal bleeding, but his body was completely spent. His red and white uniform was in tatters, caked in dried crimson and blackened soot. He dragged himself out of the debris with one arm, his gaze locking onto the massive Saiyan standing in the moonlight. Nolan didn't attack. For the first time since he had arrived on Earth decades ago, the Conqueror of Worlds felt a cold, paralyzing weight in his chest. Genuine terror. Broly didn't look at Nolan again. He turned his back on the broken Viltrumite and began walking westward toward the mountains, his solitary figure vanishing into the cold, desert darkness in search of food and peace. In the GDA bunker, Cecil Stedman reached for his direct red phone, bypassing the entire United States government. "Donald," Cecil said quietly, watching the thermal satellite feed track the walking giant. "Get a transport loaded with 50 tons of raw beef, military emergency rations, and fresh water. Drop it 10 miles ahead of his path in the mountains. We don't fight this thing, we feed it." The Sierra Nevada mountain range cut through the horizon like broken slate against the midnight sky. Cold winds howling down from the snow-capped ridges did nothing to cool the radiating heat pouring from Broly's bare shoulders. Every footstep he drove into the frozen granite left a smoking, vitrified imprint. His body was operating on raw fumes. The metabolic engine of a Saiyan that had just breached 2 planetary thresholds and ripped an interdimensional gateway in half was violently eating its own fat and muscle stores. Broly stopped at the crest of a ridge 11,000 feet above sea level. He didn't need a scouter to find what lay in the valley below. His sensory receptors, sharpened by 40 years of hunting venomous, multi-legged beasts in the acidic caverns of Vampa, picked up the scent long before he saw it. The iron-rich musk of raw animal flesh, dry vacuum-sealed carbohydrates, and clean mountain spring water. In the center of a wide glacial plateau sat 4 massive, matte black GDA cargo containers. They were stamped with no national insignia, but active optical transponders pulsed silent infrared pings directly up to the orbital network. The heavy pneumatic doors of the containers had been mechanically blown open, spilling pa. Lits of raw, flash-frozen sides of beef, sealed crates of high-calorie survival paste, and thousands of gallons of purified water onto the snow. Broly descended the ridge in 3 crushing leaps. He didn't inspect the crates for poison or booby traps. In Broly's world, danger was an ambient condition, not an ambush. He grabbed an entire frozen half-carcass of steer in one scarred hand, tore through the ice and bone with his bare teeth, and began consuming the meat with mechanical, terrifying speed. He ate not with the civilized manners of modern humanoids, but with the brutal urgency of an apex predator. Tendons snapped, marrow-rich bones were pulverized between his molars, and crates of GDA nutrient paste were squeezed directly down his throat like water. Within 20 minutes, 40 tons of food had been reduced to splintered wooden pallets, torn steel tins, and clean, white bone fragments. Broly sat back against the cold granite wall of the canyon, his massive chest expanding as a deep, biological warmth washed through his circulatory system. His cells drank in the calories, immediately initiating the micro-repair of torn ligaments and replenishing his massive Kai wellspring. He pulled the green pelt of Ba tighter around his waist, closed his dark eyes, and for the first time since falling into this strange reality, fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. 5 miles above the plateau, an invisible, cloaked GDA stealth drone hovered on silent ion thrusters. Inside the Global Defense Agency's command bridge beneath the Pentagon, Cecil Stedman watched the telemetry on the master screen. Donald stood next to him, running a handheld tablet that displayed a rapidly declining threat matrix. Metabolic absorption rate is 98%, Donald reported, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He consumed enough calories in 22 minutes to sustain a mechanized infantry division for 3 months. Director, his body temperature dropped 3 degrees once he fell asleep. The seismic resonance has completely flatlined. He's not a conqueror, Cecil murmured, chewing on his unlit cigar. A Viltrumite would have leveled Vegas on principle just to establish dominance. This guy just wanted a meal and a place to lie down. The double doors of the command bridge hissed, open with violent force. Debbie Grayson stood in the entryway, flanked by 2 armed GDA security guards who looked utterly terrified to touch her. Behind her, supported by an advanced exoskeleton walker and a neck brace, was Mark Grayson. His face was a patchwork of yellowing bruises, his right arm bound tightly in a high-density stabilization cast. "Where is he, Cecil?" Debbie's voice was venomous, stripped of her usual maternal warmth. "Where is Nalan?" Cecil didn't turn around immediately. He kept his eyes locked on the thermal feed of the sleeping giant. "Donald, get Mrs. Grayson and Mark a seat." "I don't want a damn seat," Debbie shouted, marching up to the catwalk railing. Nalan was brought in through the sub-level medical bay 2 hours ago. His vitals are failing. His spine has 3 compression fractures, his lungs are filled with fluid, and the medical team says his cellular regeneration isn't keeping up with the damage. What did this to him? Mark stepped forward, his breathing shallow. "It wasn't a monster, Mom, it was a guy with black hair." Mark looked at Cecil, his voice dropping into a whisper. "Cecil, he didn't even use his full strength on me. He swatted me away like I was nothing. Dad." Dad hit him as hard as he could, and the guy didn't even blink. Cecil finally turned, his scarred face grim. "Your father picked a fight with something that doesn't fit on our threat charts, Mark. We threw 3 tactical gunships, your team, Omni-Man, and an orbital particle beam at that entity. He wiped out the Flaxen Armada with his bare hands 20 seconds later." "Then kill him," Debbie demanded, tears of rage shining in her eyes. "Use the bombs, use whatever you have before he wakes up and finishes Nalan off." "No," Cecil said flatly. "Cecil." "Look at the screen, Debbie," Cecil barked, pointing a scarred finger at the sleeping form of Broly. "We dropped food, he ate it, he went to sleep. If I drop a thermonuclear warhead on that mountain, all it's going to do is burn off his shirt, make him mad, and point him toward the east coast. We do not poke this bear again. We monitor, we feed, and we pray to whatever god you believe in that he doesn't decide to leave those mountains." Thousands of light years across the galactic plane, Deep within the obsidian-walled gladiatorial arenas of the Thraxa border worlds, the blood had barely dried on the sand. A colossal leonine humanoid stood atop a mound of severed alien torsos. His white mane was soaked crimson, his dual battle axes dripping with the viscous, purple entrails of a dozen conquered warlords. He wore heavy, archaic bronze armor across his broad shoulders, his glee-visible eye burning with an eternal, unsatisfied lust for combat. Battle Beast, Thok, wiped a clot of gore from his snout with the back of his gauntlet. Pathetic, Thok growled, his voice rumbling like an avalanche across the quiet arena. Is there no one in this forsaken quadrant who can make my heart beat? No one who can grant me an honorable death? From the shadows of the arena box, a hooded broker of the coalition of planets stepped forward, holding a shimmering holographic datapad. Lord Thok, the broker spoke cautiously, keeping 10 paces of distance between himself and the beast. A localized dimensional rupture occurred in Sector 2814, a primitive world known as Earth. Earth, Thok sneered, spitting on the corpses beneath his boots. That mudball is protected by a solitary Viltrumite scout. Nolan is strong, but he fights with the arrogant restraint of his empire. He lacks the pure, savage thirst. It was not the Viltrumite, Lord Thok, the broker replied, bringing up the reconstructed telemetry of Broly's Emerald Kai explosion that had shattered the Flaxen Rift. A new signature appeared. Energy output exceeded the kinetic yield of a dying star. The Viltrumite was broken in less than 3 minutes. An entire invasion armada was erased from the timeline. Thok stared at the green, violent flare captured on the holographic screen. His nostrils flared. The fur along his spine stood on end. His single eye widened, dilating until the pupil engulfed the iris in a surge of pure, primal ecstasy. A savage, terrifying grin split his leonine jaws, revealing rows of dagger-sharp teeth. A beast, Thok whispered, his fingers tightening around the grips of his axes until the metal groaned under his grip. A true, unchained monster walks the stars. Thok leaped from the pile of corpses, his boots shattering the arena floor. Prepare my ship, Thok roared, his voice echoing across the Thraxan sky. Set the coordinates for Earth, I have found my war. The sub-zero winds of the Sierra Nevada whipped across the high alpine plateau, carrying stinging needles of sleet against the sheared rock. Beneath the shadow of Mount Whitney, Broly's sleep was far from silent. Every breath rattling through his massive chest released a plume of superheated vapor that melted the snow within a 30-foot circle, leaving a ring of steaming, exposed granite. Subterranean tremors hummed through the mountain's roots, a rhythmic volcanic pulse synchronized with the Saiyan's heartbeat. Deep within his slumbering mind, the nightmare unfolded. He was back in the subterranean dark of Vampa. The stench of acid pools and sulfur was suffocating. He saw Paragus standing above him on the edge of the cavern, the control remote gripped tightly in his father's weathered hand. The silver shock collar around Broly's neck hummed with high-frequency electricity, burrowing into his carotid artery like a venomous insect. You are a weapon, Broly. A weapon for the king. Control yourself or I will shock you until your heart bursts. In the dark of the dream, Broly reached out for Ba. The gigantic, green-furred beast tilted its massive serpentine head, purring like a landslide, leaning down to let Broly press his face into its warm, coarse ear. Then came the gunshot. The heavy blast of Paragus's laser rifle tore through Ba's ear, severing the bond forever, leaving the beast to retreat into the shadows, howling in betrayed agony. No, Ba, Broly muttered in his sleep, his massive fists clenching so violently that the granite underneath his knuckles groaned and pulverized into fine gray dust. A faint green aura flared along his skin, hot enough to instantly flash-boil the sleet into a dense cloud of white fog. 2,000 miles away, inside the subterranean ICU wing of the Pentagon bunker, Nolan Grayson was waking up. The medical suite was fortified like a missile silo. 6 inches of lead-lined, depleted uranium plating sealed the walls, with magnetic field generators humming at maximum output to isolate the Viltrumite's biometric signature from external scanners. 4 heavy IV lines, carrying synthetic Viltrumite-grade blood plasma derived from Nolan's previous tissue samples, were anchored into his subclavian veins with diamond-tipped needles. Nolan's eyelids snapped open. His eyes were bloodshot, the sclera stained deep purple from burst capillaries. He didn't gasp. He simply exhaled, a ragged, wet breath that smelled of copper and internal organ trauma. "He's awake," a chief GDA medical officer barked into his headset. "Stabilize the saline drip. Don't let his blood pressure spike. The repaired ventricular wall is still fragile." Nolan didn't listen to the doctor. He tore the diamond needles from his arms with a single, trembling sweep of his left hand, the thick plastic tubes spraying dark red plasma across the white linoleum floor. "Nolan, stop!" Debbie rushed to his bedside, her hands trembling as she tried to gently press him back against the elevated medical bed. "You've been out for nearly 12 hours. Cecil's doctors say you almost suffered permanent organ failure. You have to rest." Nolan grabbed Debbie's wrist. His grip was weak compared to his usual unyielding strength, but it was still tight enough to leave bruises. His gaze was vacant, staring straight through the reinforced ceiling of the bunker. "It wasn't a metahuman, Debbie," Nolan rasped, his voice vibrating with a dark, bitter cadence that terrified his wife. "It wasn't a mutated earthling or a flaxen genetic construct." "What was it then?" Mark asked, stepping into the light of the medical bay from the hallway, his right arm still held rigid in its carbon fiber cast. Nolan slowly turned his head toward his son. The cold, unyielding mask of Omni-Man, the invincible hero, the benevolent savior of humanity, was completely cracked, revealing the raw, paranoid terror of an Imperial soldier who had encountered something outside the Empire's calculations. "It was a predator," Nolan said, each word sounding like grinding teeth. "A creature whose biology feeds on violence. In the Empire's archives, there were ancient records, legends from the first age of expansion, rumors of a race of tail-bearing, black-haired apes that lived only for slaughter, whose power multiplied every time they were struck." Nolan pulled himself upright, his spine clicking as the fractured vertebrae fought against the strain. "Grand Regent Thrag purged those records 10,000 years ago," Nolan continued, his jaw trembling with cold fury. "He claimed they were extinct, a myth invented by weak worlds to justify their cowardice. But that beast on the mountain, it carries that same blood. If the Viltrum Empire learns that an unchained warrior of that lineage lives on Earth, they won't send an assimilation vanguard." Nolan looked straight into Mark's eyes. "They will send the Grand Armada. They will glass this entire solar system from orbit just to burn his bones." In the deep void of space, past the frozen orbit of Neptune, an archaic dreadnought-class warship dropped out of hyperspace. The vessel had no sleek lines or advanced particle cloaks. It was a brutalist wedge of black iron and reinforced blast plating, scarred by centuries of laser burns, planetary defense cannons, and the claws of colossal cosmic megafauna. Standing on the open observation deck, exposed to the vacuum of space through a shimmering, atmospheric containment field, Battle Beast inhaled deeply. His keen, predatory senses, attuned over a millennium of blood sport across 3 galaxies, could already feel the faint, rhythmic harmonic pulsing through the solar system. It was not the sterile, disciplined hum of a Viltrumite's smart atoms. It was a raw, chaotic tectonic scream of life energy. Kai. Thok raised his massive twin battle axes, slamming the bronze shafts together with a resounding clang that echoed through the iron corridors of his ship. "Set course for the 3rd planet," Thok commanded his robotic navigator, his voice rumbling with pure, blood-soaked euphoria. "Clear the drop pod. When we breach the atmosphere, do not slow down." The high-altitude silence above Mount Whitney did not break gradually. It shattered under the weight of an atmospheric drop pod traveling at Mach 60. There were no retro thrusters. There was no deployment of heat shields or deceleration parachutes. The jagged, iron wedge plummeted through the upper stratosphere, superheating into a roaring comet of orange friction fire before spearing directly into the granite peak of the mountain. Kaboom! The entire upper ridge of Mount Whitney, 2 million tons of ancient, snow-crested stone collapsed inward, pulverized into a volcanic cloud of dust and fractured boulders. A kinetic shockwave swept across the Inyo National Forest, snapping miles of pine trees like matchsticks and blowing the snow cover off 3 adjacent peaks in a single second. At the center of the impact crater, 500 feet below the shattered ridgeline, Broly stood upright. He had not been crushed. He had caught the jagged nosecone of the 400-ton iron drop pod on his left shoulder, bracing against the kinetic force with his boots sunken knee-deep into the bedrock. His eyes were wide, dark, and alert, his sleep wiped away in a heartbeat by the smell of scorched iron, blood, and burning ozone. The pneumatic locks of the pod hissed, blowing thick green coolant steam across the crater floor. The iron door was not kicked open. It was ripped completely off its heavy industrial hinges by a clawed, bronze-gauntleted hand. The 3-inch-thick alloy slab was tossed aside like a scrap of parchment, spinning 3 times through the air before embedding itself into the canyon wall. From the steaming interior stepped Battle Beast. Thok towered over 8 feet tall, a mountain of dense, white-furred muscle wrapped in scarred bronze. Battle harnesses. His long, snow-colored mane was braided with the dried finger bones of slain warlords, and his single golden eye burned with an insatiable, ecstatic bloodlust. In his left hand, he held a massive, double-bladed battle axe forged from collapsed neutronium. In his right, a serrated, barbed short sword that dripped with the dried, dark purple ichor of 100 conquered champions. Thok planted his heavy, clawed boots onto the shattered granite, took a deep, dragging breath of the thin mountain air, and locked his gaze directly onto Broly. "You," Thok rumbled, his voice like grinding millstones, sending a subsonic tremor through the rock beneath their feet. "You are the anomaly that broke the Viltrumite." Broly did not answer. He lowered his shoulder, letting the crushed wreckage of the drop pod slide off his back and smash into the rubble behind him. His gaze dropped to the jagged blades in Thok's hands, then rose to the white-furred predator's fangs. There was no shock collar around this creature's neck. There was no sneer of imperial entitlement like Nolan had worn. This was something worse, an animal that hunted not for territory, not for food, but for the pure, unadulterated joy of the kill. It carried the exact same scent as the venomous megafauna of Vampa, the massive crater stalkers that crawled through the acid bogs just to tear living flesh from bone. "I am Thok, champion of the Blood Plains, scourge of the Thraxan Verge," the beast roared, raising his neutronium axe and pointing the jagged edge straight at Broly's throat. "I have crossed 3 galaxies for a battle worthy of my life's end. Show me the rage that tore the Flaxan Void apart. Give me a death, or grant me your corpse." Broly's scarred chest expanded. A low, gravelly sound tore from his throat, a warning growl so deep it made the pebbles at Thok's feet bounce into the air. "Go away," Broly rasped, his fists clenching at his sides. "I do not want your fight." Thok threw his head back and laughed, a booming, terrifying sound that echoed across the ruined mountain range. "You do not choose," Thok snarled. "The strong take, the weak bleed. There is no peace in this universe, beast, only the hunt." Thok moved. For a creature of his colossal mass, his acceleration defied physical comprehension. He crossed the 60 yards between them in less than a millisecond, his neutronium axe cleaving through the air with a deafening, vacuum-tearing whistle aimed directly at Broly's collarbone. Broly raised his right arm to block the blow. Clang shatter. The neutronium edge struck Broly's forearm. The sheer density of the cosmic alloy, backed by Thok's planet-cleaving muscular thrust, sliced through the Saiyan's baseline epidermal layer. A fine spray of bright red Saiyan blood splattered across the snow. The pain was sharp, hot, and immediate. Thok's golden eye dilated in pure, frenzied joy. "Yes, you bleed. Your skin is flesh, not iron." Without pausing, Thok drove the serrated short sword in his right hand straight toward Broly's solar plexus, twisting the blade to gut the giant in a single, surgical disembowelment stroke. Broly's hand clamped down on the blade. His scarred fingers wrapped around the razor-sharp teeth of the cosmic sword, ignoring the blade cutting deep into his palm. Saiyan blood dripped onto the stone, and where the blood struck the frozen granite, it hissed, superheated by the biological reactor igniting inside his veins. The molten amber ring flared to life around Broly's irises. Broly's voice dropped an octave, the terrifying double tone of the Uzaru vibrating through his vocal cords like thunder. It made me bleed. Thok tried to wrench the sword free, but it was like pulling a blade embedded in a solid block of diamond. Broly didn't use a technique, he simply twisted his wrist. Snap! The ancient neutronium short sword, a relic that had severed the skulls of 1,000 alien monarchs, shattered into 3 jagged iron shards in Broly's bare hand. Before Thok could comprehend the loss of his weapon, Broly's forehead slammed forward like an anvil. Crack! The headbutt struck Thok directly between the eyes. The white fur on the beast's snout split open, spraying dark blood as his skull rattled violently against his spine. The kinetic impact was so violent that the bedrock beneath both warriors collapsed another 20 feet, forming a new, subterranean fighting pit. Thok stumbled back 3 paces, shaking his head, his vision swimming with white sparks. But instead of retreating, a manic, bloody grin split his leonine jaws. Magnificent, Thok screamed, blood pouring down his white fangs. Again! Thok swung his massive battle axe with both hands, throwing his entire body weight into a horizontal strike designed to cleave Broly in 2 at the waist. Broly didn't duck, he stepped directly into the swing. Thom! The blunt spine of the axe struck Broly's ribs. But this time the blade didn't penetrate. The emerald aura, thick, dense, and violently fluctuating, had risen to the surface of Broly's skin, acting as a kinetic repulsor shield. Broly caught Thok by the throat with his left hand, digging his fingers deep into the thick white fur of the beast's neck. With his right fist, wrapped in a blazing, crackling sphere of pure jade kai, Broly drove a savage, piston-like strike straight into Thok's armored chest plate. The bronze armor shattered like ceramic tile. Thok's sternum caved inward with a sickening crunch. The breath was violently blasted from his lungs as the Kai detonation blew him straight through the western wall of the canyon, hurtling him through 3 separate mountain peaks before the beast crashed into the Owens Valley floor 5 miles away. Broly hung suspended in the smoking crater, his black hair spiking upward in jagged, violent crests. The green lightning dancing across his shoulders had begun to arc into the clouds, turning the entire night sky above California into a storm of glowing, emerald wrath. Down in the valley, buried under 40 feet of shattered granite, a bloody, clawed hand pushed through the rubble. Thok pulled himself out of the earth, coughing up dark, thick blood, his shattered chest wheezing as he looked up at the glowing green god descending from the clouds. More, Thok whispered, his single eye burning with the ultimate fire. Give me more. The blood pooling in Thok's fractured chest did not quell his frenzy, it ignited it. The leonine warlord planted his clawed boots into the pulverized granite of Owens Valley, spitting a mouthful of shattered fangs and dark gore onto the frozen earth. His shattered sternum groaned as his hyperdense musculature contracted violently, forcing his broken ribs away from his lungs through sheer biological willpower. A warrior, an absolute unblemished god of slaughter, Thok roared toward the heavens. He gripped the shaft of his remaining neutronium battle axe with both bloodied hands, bending his knees until the bedrock beneath him fractured into spiderweb fissures. With a leap that produced a localized earthquake measuring 6.5 on the Richter scale, Battle Beast launched himself back toward the descending emerald star. Broly met him midair. There was no martial finesse, no calculated parry or tactical feint. It was an apocalyptic collision of 2 biological extremes. Clang Thom! Thok's axe struck Broly's collarbone with enough kinetic energy to shear an oceanic tectonic plate. The blade bit half an inch into the Saiyan's flesh before arresting completely, wedged against the hyperdense, Kai-infused clavicle bone. Broly did not flinch. The pain simply severed the remaining cognitive links to his rational mind. HRAH. Broly's roar ripped the surrounding atmosphere into a localized vacuum. He grabbed the bearded blade of the neutronium axe with his bare right hand, wrenching it free from his own shoulder, and clamped his left hand onto Thok's leonine muzzle. Green lightning tore across the sky, turning midnight into an eerie, radioactive noon. Broly dragged Battle Beast downward at Mach 80, using the alien warlord's skull as a kinetic plow. They struck the valley floor, carving a 3-mile-long trench through solid bedrock, superheating the displaced stone into a roaring river of molten magma. Thok, half-blinded by his own blood and the blinding jade radiation, drove his clawed gauntlet straight into Broly's side, tearing through flesh to find a vital organ. His talons scraped against Broly's lower ribs, seeking the heart. "Feel it," Thok choked out through crushed jaws, blood spraying from his snout. "The ecstasy of the edge, the glorious end." Broly's amber gold irises flared with blinding intensity. He released Thok's snout, gripped the beast's right arm at the elbow and wrist, and brutally wrenched it counterclockwise. Crack snap. The thick, dense bone of Thok's forearm shattered outward through the white fur in a compound fracture. Thok did not scream in pain, he laughed, a wet, maniacal, rattling roar of pure adulation. "Yes, tear me asunder." Broly threw his right arm back, his fist engulfed in an incandescent, volatile sphere of green Kai that condensed until space itself warped around his knuckles. The eraser cannon detonated point-blank against Thok's exposed torso. Kaboom! The detonation hollowed out the valley, creating a crater 2 miles wide and tossing millions of tons of pulverized earth into the stratosphere. The shockwave stripped the forest bare for 50 miles in every direction. When the dust began to settle, the center of the crater was an expanse of boiling glass. Thok lay at the bottom of the pit, his ancient armor vaporized, his left arm broken, his chest a charred, hollowed ruin of exposed bone and seared muscle. He was broken beyond the capacity of even his legendary physiology to immediately regenerate. Yi. Through the bloody ruin of his face, his single golden eye stared up at Broly with reverence. "You are perfection," Thok whispered, his voice fading to a ragged rasp as his consciousness finally slipped into the dark. "A true beast." Broly stood over the fallen warlord, his chest heaving. The wound on his collarbone was already closing, the Saiyan healing factor sealing the laceration under a layer of fresh scar tissue. The amber glow in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by the deep, haunted obsidian of a man exhausted by the relentless demands of his own bloodline. He looked at his blood-stained hands, then down at the unconscious beast. He did not deliver the killing blow. On Vampa, an opponent that could no longer bear its fangs was no longer prey. It was simply part of the wasteland. Broly turned away, his heavy boots crunching over the cooling glass as he walked toward the deep shadows of the northern canyons. Deep in the black void between Jupiter and Saturn, an Imperial Viltrumite long-range surveillance vessel sat motionless in the shadow of Callisto. Inside the bridge, 2 elite Viltrumite reconnaissance officers stood frozen before the holographic array. The recorded telemetry of the battle, the energy yields, the destruction of Battle Beast, the complete failure of Nolan Grayson, played on a continuous, terrifying loop. "This is not an indigenous Earth metahuman," the first officer stated, his voice flat with cold, clinical dread. "The biological output matches the forbidden codices of the ancient ape lineage." "Nolan has failed containment," the second officer replied, initiating the emergency quantum transmission array. "Transmit the raw telemetry directly to the flagship Fist of Viltrum." Across the galaxy, deep within the conquered sectors of the Coalition border, the transmission pierced the Imperial flagship's communications array. Grand Regent Thrag sat upon his iron throne, his cold eyes scanning the green energy flares recorded on Earth. Next to him stood Conquest, the scarred, one-eyed warmonger of the Empire, whose lips curled into a vicious, bloodthirsty sneer. "Prepare the vanguard," Thrag commanded, his voice echoing with absolute cosmic finality. "We do not send scouts, we take the entire fleet to Earth." The subterranean medical bunker beneath the Pentagon smelled of dried blood, electrical ozone, and clinical despair. Nolan Grayson stood before the reinforced blast door mirror, methodically fastening the high-tensile clasps of a fresh Viltrumite tunic. The white fabric, bisected by the crimson chevron of the Empire, stretched tight over a torso that was a landscape of deep purple contusions. His broken ribs had fused back together, but the cellular repair was rushed, leaving his breathing shallow and jagged. Every pulse of his heart carried a dull, throbbing reminder of the crushing mass that had driven him into the Nevada bedrock. Behind him, Cecil Stedman leaned against the primary telemetry console, his unlit cigar clamped between his teeth. "You're not cleared for field deployment, Nolan," Cecil said, his voice stripped of its usual diplomatic veneer. "Your internal scans look like a crushed soda that's only half popped back out. Battle Beast is currently in a medically induced coma in Sublevel 4, and that thing in the Sierra Nevada didn't even sustain a hairline fracture." Nolan didn't look back. His cold, slate-gray eyes stared straight through his own reflection. "Battle Beast is an undisciplined savage who fought with archaic steel. He sought a glorious death, and he nearly got it. I am not looking for glory, Cecil. I am executing an Imperial mandate." "An Imperial mandate?" Cecil's eyes narrowed. "You've spent 20 years playing the Boy Scout in red boots, telling us you're here to prepare humanity to join a peaceful galactic coalition. Now you're talking like an occupying general." Nolan slowly turned around. The facade of Omni-Man, the gentle father who grilled burgers on Sundays and smiled for the evening news, was entirely gone. In its place stood the cold, emotionless executioner of the Viltrum Empire. "Humanity is fragile, Cecil. You squabble over dirt, you build weapons that can barely singe a Viltrumite's epidermal layer, and you think you have a seat at the table." Nolan spoke with venomous clarity, stepping past Cecil toward the pneumatic lift. "That creature in the mountains represents a biological disease. If I do not eradicate it before the Grand Fleet arrives, Thrag will not bother assimilating this world. He will burn the atmosphere and crack the tectonic mantle down to the molten core. You are alive because I allow it. Now stay out of my way." Before Cecil could hit the lockdown alarm, Nolan accelerated, shattering the concrete ceiling of the Pentagon and tearing through 5,000 feet of airspace toward the western horizon in a sonic detonation that shattered every window within a 3-mile radius. High, in the Sierra Nevada, the air was crystalline and biting. Broly sat on a high outcropping of red sandstone overlooking the Owens Valley Basin. In front of him burned a low, crackling fire fueled by dry pine logs. Suspended over the embers on an iron spit was the carcass of a massive elk he had run down on foot an hour earlier. The scars across Broly's chest and arms were pale in the morning light. He chewed on a roasted haunch with slow, measured bites, his dark eyes staring out at the expansive forest canopy below. The silence of the mountain was clean. For the first time since the dimensional rift had spit him onto this world, the suffocating hum of surveillance satellites felt distant, muffled by the sheer density of the wilderness. He reached down to adjust the coarse green pelt of Ba at his hip, his rough thumbs smoothing over the thick, bristled fur. "Quiet," Broly whispered to the wind. The wind did not answer. The air pressure suddenly spiked, dropping 50 millibars in a millisecond. A red and white blur dropped out of the upper stratosphere, impacting 50 yards from the campsite with the kinetic force of a bunker-buster bomb. The shockwave blew the fire to ash and sent the half-roasted elk flying into the ravine below. Broly didn't flinch. He slowly rose to his full height, his massive shoulders rolling back as his dark eyes locked onto the figure stepping through the dust cloud. Nolan Grayson stood with his fists clenched, his white cape snapping violently in the updraft. The bruises along his jaw were hidden beneath a mask of absolute, imperial contempt. "You should have died on whatever dead world birthed you, beast," Nolan said, his voice echoing across the canyon like grinding granite. "You don't belong in this universe. You are an evolutionary dead end, a mindless ape pretending to be a warrior." Broly's brow furrowed. He looked down at the scattered ashes of his meal, then back at Nolan. "You broke my fire," Broly said, his voice low, heavy, and dangerous. "I left you in the dirt. Why do you come back?" Because on this world, and every world under the light of the stars, the Viltrum Empire does not retreat, Nolan roared. Nolan ignited his flight mechanism to absolute maximum thrust. He crossed the distance in a microsecond, driving a ruthless, straight-line right cross directly into Broly's throat, aiming to crush the Saiyan's trachea and sever his spinal cord in a single kinetic strike. Clang! The impact created a vacuum bubble that stripped the bark off every tree on the plateau. Broly's neck snapped back an inch, but his boots remained anchored to the mountain. His dense, Kai-infused muscle tissue absorbed the blow, converting the shockwave into pure ambient thermal energy. Broly slowly lowered his chin, his dark eyes locking onto Nolan's widened gaze. "You talk too much," Broly growled. Broly's left hand shot out like an iron clamp, grabbing Nolan by his thick, graying hair. Before the Viltrumite could pull free, Broly drove his right fist straight up into Nolan's solar plexus with the force of an erupting volcano. Thom. The impact caved Nolan's chest inward, forcing a fountain of dark Viltrumite blood past his lips. The sheer kinetic displacement blew out the entire backside of Nolan's uniform, shredding the white fabric into burning ribbons. Broly didn't let go of his hair. He spun Nolan around like a rag doll and slammed him face first into the solid granite outcropping, shattering the stone beneath them. He lifted him and slammed him down again, and again, and again. Crack, crack, crack. The entire mountain shuddered. Deep fissures opened along the canyon walls as Broly pulverized the Viltrumite into the bedrock, using pure, unadulterated brute force to dismantle the conqueror's frame. Nolan, coughing up blood, managed to drive his thumbs into Broly's wrists, channeling every ounce of his centuries-old combat experience into a desperate leverage throw. He broke the grip, spun midair, and hammered a double-axe handle strike directly onto the bridge of Broly's nose. The strike split the skin along Broly's forehead. A single drop of crimson Saiyan blood welled up, dripping down the bridge of his nose and onto his upper lip. Broly stopped. He reached up with a scarred thumb, wiping the blood from his brow. He looked at the red stain on his skin, then at Nolan. The air around the plateau turned violently cold. Small stones, boulders weighing 10 tons, and shattered tree trunks began to slowly rise into the air, caught in a massive, localized anti-gravitational field. The veins along Broly's neck and temples swelled, pulsing with a bright, radioactive emerald luminescence. The molten amber rings in his irises flared to life, burning with an unchained, apocalyptic fury. HRAAGH. The wrathful state unlocked completely. Broly's muscular frame expanded by 30%, his traps swelling until they framed his face like iron walls. His black H. Air surged upward in jagged electric spikes, crackling with violent jade lightning that split the sky. The sheer pressure of his awakening Kai flattened the surrounding ridges, leveling the mountaintop into a smooth, smoking mesa of pulverized quartz. Nolan stepped back, his flight stabilization wavering under the sheer atmospheric density of Broly's aura. For the first time in his 500 years of life, Omni-Man realized that the creature standing before him was not just a powerful metahuman. It was a walking, extinction-level event. Broly disappeared from sight. There was no sound of flight. There was only the sudden, catastrophic displacement of space. Broly materialized directly in front of Nolan, his massive fist already buried deep into the Viltrumite's abdomen. The shockwave folded Nolan in half, his spine bowing outward at an unnatural angle. Before Nolan could fall, Broly grabbed him by both shoulders, lifted him high above his head, and brought him down across his elevated knee with the force of a falling meteor. Snap! The sound of Nolan Grayson's, spine-shattering echoed across the burning Sierra Nevada. Broly threw the broken Viltrumite into the dirt like a discarded carcass. He stood over him, his chest heaving, his mouth open as emerald Kai poured from his lips like dragon's breath. High in the upper atmosphere, having tracked his father's flight vector from the Pentagon, Invincible dropped through the clouds. Mark Grayson froze midair, his eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing horror as he looked down at the ruined plateau. His father, the invincible Omni-Man, the strongest being on the planet, lay crumpled in a pool of his own blood, paralyzed, broken, and helpless beneath the shadow of the green-haired Titan. "Dad!" Mark screamed, plummeting toward the crater. The scorched plateau of Mount Whitney smelled of copper, ionized ozone, and the bitter sulfur of vaporized stone. Mark Grayson dropped from the sky like a dead weight, slamming his boots onto the glass-fused earth between the towering Saiyan and the crumpled form of his father. His blue and yellow suit was caked in grime and dry sweat, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow gasps. His cast had been crudely ripped off his right forearm, leaving the newly knit bones throbbing with a dull ache under the strain of his flight. "Dad!" Mark choked out, dropping to his knees. Nolan lay twisted at an unnatural angle. His spine was crushed, his breathing reduced to a wet, rattling hiss that blew crimson bubbles across his split lips. His slate-gray eyes were unfocused, staring through Mark into the cloudless azure sky. When Nolan tried to speak, only a thick clot of dark blood spilled over his teeth. Mark turned, scrambling backward to shield his father's broken body with his own. He stood up, trembling, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white. Tears cut tracks through the soot on his cheeks, but beneath the grief was the raw, desperate fury of a son backed into a corner. "Stay back!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking violently across the smoking crater. "Don't touch him, you hear me? Stay the hell away from him." Broly looked down at the boy. The massive Saiyan stood motionless in the smoking ruin. His hair remained flared in jagged black and emerald crests, crackling with intermittent sparks of jade electricity, but the wild, blind fury in his eyes had begun to recede. The golden amber glow around his pupils dimmed, softening back into deep obsidian dark. Broly tilted his head, his brow furrowing as he studied Mark. He didn't see an imperial conqueror with iron fists and cold speeches. He didn't see a bloodthirsty beast seeking an honorable grave like Thok. He saw a boy, bruised, terrified, standing over the broken body of a parent, willing to be torn to pieces just to buy another second of life for someone he loved. The memory hit Broly like an icy blow. The cold caves of Vampa, the bitter wind howling outside the shelter, and the weathered face of Paragus wrapping a torn blanket around his shoulders after a brutal hunt. For all of Paragus's cruelty, for all the agony of the shock collar, he had still been his father. Broly's massive shoulders lowered an inch. The heavy, suffocating pressure of his aura subsided, letting the ambient mountain wind return to the valley. "He came to kill," Broly rasped, his voice low, gravelly, and stripped of the Uzaru's double echo. "He brought the fight." "He was trying to protect the planet," Mark yelled back, his voice breaking into a desperate sob. "He's my dad, he was just trying to stop you." "No," Broly said simply. He pointed a scarred, thick finger at Nolan. "He fights, like a king, like a master who wants a slave. He wanted to put me in the dirt." Broly took a half-step forward. Mark flinched, immediately raising his arms to brace for an impact he knew he could not survive. His teeth chattered, every instinct screaming at him to flee. But his boots stayed, planted firmly on the stone in front of Nolan's head. Broly stopped 3 paces away. He looked down at Mark's trembling arms, then at the tear-streaked face beneath the mask. "Take him," Broly said quietly. Mark blinked, his breathing hitching. "What?" "Take him, leave this place," Broly repeated, turning his broad back to them and walking toward the edge of the flattened ridge. "If he comes back with teeth, I will break them all." Before Mark could process the mercy of a creature that had just dismantled Earth's greatest champion, the sky overhead did not flash blue with a GDA teleport. Instead, it turned completely, sickeningly dark. In low Earth orbit, the Global Defense Agency's orbital telemetry array went haywire. Deep inside the Pentagon command bunker, red alert klaxons wailed with an ear-splitting, continuous screech. Donald dropped a stack of hard-copy diagnostic charts, his hands shaking as he stared at the primary astronomical tracking projection. "Director," Donald yelled over the sirens. We have multiple massive gravitational anomalies exiting hyperspace past the moon. Spatial displacement is off the scale. Cecil Stedman walked slowly to the edge of the command catwalk, his face carved from pale gray granite. How many ships? It's not ships, sir, Donald whispered, his voice trembling so hard his teeth clicked. The vessels just dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the lunar perimeter, and then the occupants exited the hulls. On the master holographic display, a high-resolution satellite feed resolved the image of the space above the moon. Over 50 humanoid figures floated in the absolute zero vacuum of space, bathed in the pale light of Earth. Every single one wore the stark white and crimson tunic of the Viltrum Empire. At the vanguard of the armada hovered 3 figures whose presence radiated absolute planetary slaughter. To the left was General Craig, his scarred face stoic, his mechanical right eye spinning with tactical targeting overlays. To the right stood Conquest, his massive, cybernetic arm gleaming under the starlight, a jagged, psychopathic grin splitting his scarred face as he cracked his knuckles. And floating 10 meters ahead of them all, cloaked in an aura of pure imperial supremacy, was Grand Regent Thrag. Thrag's eyes were cold, calculating, and devoid of any human empathy. He did not look at the satellites or the glittering cities of Earth. His gaze cut straight through the atmosphere, locking onto the faint, lingering jade energy signature radiating from the Sierra Nevada mountains. Nolan has fallen, Thrag's voice resonated through the imperial comm frequency, calm, absolute, and merciless. The great ape's bloodline is awake on this world. Conquest chuckled, a dark, wet sound that vibrated through the comms. Shall I go down and break his neck, Grand Regent? It has been centuries since I crushed something with real bone density. No, Thrag replied, raising his right hand. We do not waste time with single duels. Conquest, Craig, Lucan, take the vanguard. Descend upon the coordinates. Eradicate the beast, execute the traitor Nolan and his half-breed spawn, and prepare this planet for full planetary cleansing. 50 Viltrumite warriors ignited their flight mechanisms simultaneously. They did not descend as mere meteors. They formed a synchronized, kinetic wedge that tore through the upper atmosphere at Mach 200, igniting the entire night sky of the Western Hemisphere in a blazing, blood-red firewall. Down in the crater, Mark looked up at the burning sky, his heart stopping in sheer horror. Broly looked up as well. As 50 planetary conquerors plummeted toward the mountain, the Saiyan's dark eyes locked onto the descending wall of fire. The hair on his arms stood on end. The dormant, boundless wellspring of Kai deep within his chest tore wide open, responding to the arrival of an entire army of predators. Broly reached down, tightened the green pelt of Ba around his waist, and let out a roar that shattered the remaining mountain beneath his feet. The atmosphere above Mount Whitney did not simply part. It ignited into an ocean of compressed friction plasma. 50 sonic booms detonated within a fraction of a second, tearing through the cloud ceiling and converting thousands of cubic miles of alpine air into a screaming vacuum. The sheer kinetic displacement of 50 elite Viltrumite warriors descending at terminal velocity shattered the ridgeline of the Sierra Nevada, flattening pine forests for 50 miles and turning falling sleet into superheated steam before it could touch the stone. At the spearhead of the atmospheric wedge was Conquest. The one-eyed butcher of the Viltrum Empire descended not with the graceful flight control of an imperial officer, but like a dirty, blood-soaked asteroid. His mechanical arm whined with immense torque as he drew it back, laughing like a lunatic as the fricked. Iron fire peeled the white tunic from his scarred chest. "Don't blink, ape," Conquest roared through the comms frequency, his voice shaking the valley bedrock. Boom! Conquest slammed both fists down directly where Broly stood. The kinetic yield was equivalent to a 50-megaton warhead. The entire southern flank of the mountain collapsed into a canyon of boiling, pulverized quartz. A 2-mile-wide shockwave expanded outward, tossing Mark Grayson and the broken body of Nolan into the air like dried leaves before Mark managed to catch his father and hurl his battered body behind a shattered ridge. At the epicenter of the crater, Conquest's grin froze. His cybernetic fist and organic knuckles had not buried themselves into crushed skull. They had stopped dead against Broly's crossed forearms. The Saiyan had not dropped a single millimeter of elevation. His boots were sunken into the granite, locked in place like the roots of a tectonic plate. The coarse green pelt of Ba fluttered wildly in the kinetic hurricane, but Broly's dark eyes were fixed squarely on Conquest's single, scarred eye. "You hit harder than the other one," Broly rasped, his voice low, guttural, and vibrating with an ancient, predatory rumble. "Still, too soft." Conquest's pupil dilated in disbelief. "What?" Before the Viltrumite veteran could disengage, Broly uncrossed his arms. With the speed of a snapping whip, his left hand clamped around Conquest's mechanical wrist, while his right forearm drove an upward elbow strike straight into Conquest's chin. Crack! The sound of shattering bone echoed over the roar of the atmospheric collapse. Conquest's jaw detached at the hinge, blood and shattered teeth spraying into the air as the sheer kinetic force blasted him upward at Mach 90, punching straight through the cloud deck. "Engage, mass strike formation." General Craig's voice cut through the Imperial comm channels with cold, mechanical authority. From the burning sky, 30 elite Viltrumite shock troopers dropped out of orbit simultaneously. They moved with millisecond synchronization, striking Broly from every conceivable vector. THOM. Pistons of diamond-hard Viltrumite muscle struck Broly's chest, spine, kidneys, and neck in an unbroken, deafening rhythm. Shockwaves rippled across the valley floor, turning solid bedrock into liquid magma from the sheer thermal friction of the blows. Lucan hammered a double-axe handle strike into the back of Broly's neck. Two female shock commanders drove spear hands into his ribs, aiming to puncture his lungs. Craig himself shot forward, his cybernetic eye tracking Broly's carotid artery as he thrust a hardened, knife-hand strike aimed to sever the Saiyan's spinal cord. Clang! Craig's fingers struck Broly's neck and bent violently backward, the joints dislocating with an audible snap. Broly didn't move. He stood at the center of 30 planetary conquerors, absorbing a barrage that would have pulverized a dozen worlds, his head lowered, his dark hair casting deep shadows over his eyes. The green lightning dancing across his skin suddenly stopped. Total, suffocating silence fell over the crater for half a heartbeat. "He's not taking damage," Lucan gasped, clutching his bruised knuckles as he hovered 5 feet away. "Craig, the kinetic feedback is breaking our hands. His cellular structure isn't yielding." Broly slowly lifted his head. His irises were gone. His pupils were gone. His eyes had turned into 2 blinding, molten spheres of pure, unbridled amber gold wrath. The wrathful state did not just awaken, it erupted like a localized supernova. A towering pillar of emerald Kai blasted outward in a 360-degree dome, instantly vaporizing the air within 5 miles. The 30 Viltrumites surrounding him were caught dead center in the kinetic expansion. Their dense, impenetrable muscle tissue was seared down to raw, red meat, as the raw spiritual pressure stripped the uniforms from their backs and shattered their flight fields. 10 lower-tier Viltrumite soldiers were instantly blown apart, their bodies torn into red mist by the sheer gravitational and thermal pressure before they could even scream. Lucan was thrown 2 miles backward, his armor melted to his chest, coughing blood as he struck the canyon wall. Broly took flight. He did not soar, he detonated the sky. He crossed the distance between himself and Craig in 0 seconds, appearing directly in front of the general. Broly drove a massive, jade-infused fist straight through Craig's abdomen. THOM. The impact blew out the back of Craig's torso in a violent eruption of crimson gore and shattered spinal fragments. Craig's cybernetic eye sparked and exploded as Broly lifted him by the ruined midsection, spun him midair, and slammed him down like an artillery shell into the magma lake below. From the burning clouds above, Conquest came screaming back down his mech. Anacle arm whirring at maximum redline output, his broken jaw dangling grotesquely as he threw his entire life's fury into a desperate, orbital drop hammer strike. "Die, you monster!" Conquest shrieked through the blood flooding his mouth. Broly looked up. He didn't raise his guard. He opened his mouth, and a massive, concentrated beam of blinding emerald Kai, the eraser cannon, tore out from his throat, meeting Conquest mid-descent. The beam swallowed Conquest whole. The Viltrumite's cybernetic arm vaporized in microseconds, followed by the skin and muscle along his torso. Conquest screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that carried across the entire continent, before the green beam blasted him back out of Earth's atmosphere, hurling his half-incinerated body into the cold void of deep orbit. Broly hung in the center of the shattered sky, his muscular frame swollen with ungodly, world-breaking power, his black hair whipping wildly as jade lightning tore through the upper stratosphere. Surrounding him, the surviving 15 Viltrumite warriors hovered in absolute, paralyzing terror. In the 5,000-year history of the Viltrum Empire, they had never witnessed a single creature tear through an elite vanguard in under 90 seconds. High above the stratosphere, watching the carnage through his flagship's forward viewport, Grand Regent Thrag slowly rose from his throne. His cold, imperial expression finally cracked into a mask of pure, murderous intent. "All ships hold orbital positions," Thrag commanded, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper. "No one else interferes. I will tear that ape's heart out myself." The mesosphere over the Pacific Rim had turned into a burning sheet of ionized neon. Below, the shattered peaks of the Sierra Nevada were obscured by a boiling carpet of emerald smoke. Above, 30 miles into the thin, black threshold of near space, Grand Regent Thrag hovered alone. He wore no ceremonial war mantle now. He was stripped to his dark imperial trousers, his hyperdense musculature carved like black iron under the harsh glare of unfiltered solar radiation. His graying hair was slicked back with ruthless precision, his mustache framing lips drawn into a thin, merciless line. Unlike Nalan or Conquest, Thrag's presence exerted an unnatural gravitational pull. The ambient space around him bent subtly under the sheer mass density of his Viltrumite anatomy. Across from him, hovering on a platform of crackling green Kai, hung Broly. The Saiyan's body was a monument to biological war. Blood from a dozen ruptured capillaries ran down his scarred chest, boiling away into green vapor before it could freeze in the sub-zero atmospheric slipstream. The wrathful state had expanded his frame to terrifying proportions. His traps rose to his ears, and the amber-gold glow in his blank, pupilless eyes burned like the core of an unstable star. 10,000 years, Thrag spoke. His voice carried not through air, but through the microscopic particulate dust suspended in the upper atmosphere, vibrating with the absolute authority of an emperor who had bathed in the blood of 10,000 worlds. 10,000 years, the Viltrum Empire purged the stars of evolutionary dead ends. My ancestors drowned your kind in their own blood to ensure the cosmos had only one apex predator. Broly did not answer with words. A low, subterranean growl tore from his chest, so violent that it set up a harmonic vibration in the hull of an imperial dreadnought orbiting 50 miles above. "You are strong, beast," Thrag said, slowly raising his right hand, extending his fingers into a rigid diamond-hard blade. "Stronger than Nalan, stronger than Conquest, but you are undisciplined. You fight like an animal thrashing in a snare, and an animal always bleeds to death." Thrag struck. He did not cross the distance. He folded the intervening space. Moving at near-relativistic speeds, Thrag delivered a spear hand strike directly into Broly's sternum. Crack shatter. The impact created a vacuum disk 40 miles wide. The shockwave stripped the ozone layer over an entire quadrant of the Pacific Ocean. The strike penetrated. Thrag's hardened fingers pierced Broly's dense epidermal shield, driving 2 inches into the Saiyan's pectorals, cracking the sternum beneath. Fresh, crimson Saiyan blood sprayed across Thrag's face. Thrag's eyes flared with cold satisfaction. "You have dense bone, ape, but not dense enough." Thrag twisted his wrist inside the wound. intending to rip Broly's heart out through his ribcage. Broly didn't scream, he didn't flinch away. Instead, Broly's massive, scarred hand snapped shut over Thrag's forearms like hydraulic steel jaws. "I am's not an animal," Broly roared, his layered double voice tearing the fabric of the surrounding air. Broly drove his forehead straight down into the bridge of Thrag's nose. Kaboom! The kinetic feedback resonated like two asteroids collide. In deep space, Thrag's head snapped back, his nose shattering into pulverized cartilage, bright red Viltrumite blood exploding over both their faces. For the first time in 5 millennia, Grand Regent Thrag stumbled backward through the stratosphere, his vision flashing pure, blinding white. Broly didn't let go of the forearms. With raw, unbridled savagery, Broly pulled Thrag back into range and hammered 5 brutal, piston-like right hooks directly into Thrag's ribs, abdomen, and jaw. Thoom, 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 Thoom. Each blow was an extinction-level event. Shockwaves rippled downward, creating supersonic tsunamis across the Pacific Ocean below. Thrag's ribs cracked, his internal organs bruised under the sheer kinetic transfer that bypassed even Viltrumite's smart atom density. "Enough," Thrag snarled, spitting blood into the void. Thrag ignited his flight mechanism with suicidal torque, driving his knee straight up into Broly's groin, breaking the Saiyan's grip, then spun midair to deliver a spinning back fist that caught Broly flush on the temple. The strike sent Broly hurtling horizontally across the curve of the earth, skipping across the upper atmosphere like a stone across water, burning a streak of incandescent orange fire from California to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in 3 seconds. Thrag pursued at Mach 300, his fists cocked, his body trailing a sonic vacuum of pure destruction. He caught Broly over the dark waters of the mid-Atlantic, driving both fists downward onto the Saiyan's spine to smash him into the oceanic abyss. Boom! The impact hollowed out the Atlantic Ocean, excavating a crater of exposed ocean floor 4 miles deep and exposing the burning mantle of the earth beneath the seabed. Thrag hovered above the boiling, vaporized sea, his chest heaving, his broken nose already setting back into place. "Perish in the deep, savage." From the boiling magma of the ocean floor, there was no groan of defeat. There was only a sound that began as a faint, high-pitched electrical hum, rising rapidly into a deafening, harmonic shriek that caused the water molecules across the entire Atlantic basin to begin vibrating in resonance. Zzzzzzzzzzzzzzzz. Deep within the boiling abyss, the emerald light shifted. It did not stay green. It turned into a blinding, golden-green incandescent blaze that illuminated the clouds across 3 continents. Broly's mind snapped. The trauma of the dimensional tier, the endless hunts on Vampa, the shock collars of his father, the arrogance of these white-caped conquerors, every agonizing memory fused into a single, singular point of boundless, infinite rage. The great ape's power within his mortal frame was no longer enough. The ancient genetic lock shattered. A pillar of pure, apocalyptic golden-green light erupted from the ocean floor, tearing straight through the clouds, through the atmosphere, and punching into deep space, slicing an orbiting Viltrumite cruiser clean in half. The Atlantic Ocean was blasted outward, creating 3,000-foot walls of displaced water around the perimeter. When the light consolidated, Thrag's cold eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing horror. Floating above the boiling magma, suspended in a roaring, jagged aura of blinding golden-green fire, stood the Super Saiyan. Broly's hair had surged upward into a towering, incandescent crown of golden emerald spikes. Violent, jade-colored lightning danced continuously across his massive shoulders and chest. His height had swelled further, his muscles bulging with impossible, universe-cleaving mass. His eyes were completely blank, pure, luminous voids of unbridled, God-killing fury. Broly took a single breath. The atmospheric pressure across the entire planet dropped by 2 millibars. Thrag gritted his teeth, his imperial pride screaming over the ancient terror chilling his veins. I am the Grand Regent of Viltrum. You are nothing. Thrag flew at Broly with everything he had, throwing his entire life's mass and speed into a punch aimed to blow the Saiyan's head to dust. Broly didn't even raise his hand. Thrag's fist struck Broly squarely on the jaw. Tink! The sound was not an explosion. It was the pitiful, hollow chime of glass hitting diamond. Broly's head did not move a single millimeter. The kinetic feedback rebounded entirely into Thrag's arm, shattering the Viltrumite Emperor's wrist, forearm, and humerus into fragmented shards inside his own flesh. Thrag looked down at his ruined arm in numb, silent disbelief. He slowly looked up. Broly looked down at the Emperor Viltrum with blank, golden eyes, opened his hand, and placed his palm gently against Thrag's face. My turn, the double-toned voice echoed through Thrag's skull. The ocean did not dare rush back into the 4-mile abyss. Held at bay by the incandescent, golden emerald gravity, well expanding from Broly's aura, billions of gallons of displaced Atlantic saltwater, churned in a towering, circular wall of boiling white foam. Grand Regent Thrag felt the heat of the palm resting against his face. It was not the thermal scorch of a plasma rifle or the friction fire of planetary re-entry. It was the absolute, unyielding pressure of a collapsing star. The fractured bones in his shattered arm hung limp at his side, his hyperdense Viltrumite physiology trembling for the first time in 10,000 years. I am Viltrum, Thrag spat past broken teeth, his left hand clenching into a desperate spear blade. The bloodline of champions cannot be snuffed by an ape. With the last reserve of his imperial will, Thrag drove his remaining good hand straight toward Broly's eye socket. Crack! The tips of Thrag's fingers shattered upon impact with the Saiyan's eyelid. Not a single drop of golden blood fell. Broly did not even blink. The blank, blinding voids of Broly's Super Saiyan eyes remained fixed on Thrag. You speak of blood, Broly's voice boomed, not through the air but through the microscopic atomic grid of spacetime itself, vibrating with a terrifying, layered double timbre. Your blood is weak. Broly closed his fingers. His scarred hand clamped over Thrag's skull like a hydraulic press. With a single, explosive flex of his forearms, Broly accelerated straight up. They did not break the sound barrier. They dismantled it. Broly dragged Thrag through 60 miles of atmosphere in a single fraction of a microsecond, the friction turning Thrag's imperial trousers to ash and searing the flesh along the Viltrumite's torso down to the muscle tissue. They breached low Earth orbit, entering the freezing black void bathed in the cold light of the stars. Broly halted instantly, the sudden kinetic stop snapping Thrag's neck vertebrae with a sickening crunch. The Saiyan held the Grand Regent of Viltrum aloft before the shattered lunar horizon, looking upon the Emperor who had brought terror to 100,000 worlds. Thrag's eyes bulged, dark blood boiling instantly in the vacuum as it leaked from his nose and mouth. He clawed weakly at Broly's wrist with his broken fingers, the proud, unyielding ruler reduced to a choking, broken husk against the void. Broly drew his left fist back to his hip. A swirling sphere of concentrated jade kai, dense, volatile, and swirling with golden solar corona, materialized in his open palm. The gigantic eraser warped the light of distant stars, its gravitational pull dragging space debris toward Broly's knuckles. Disappear, Broly growled. Broly shoved the sphere dead center into Thrag's chest. Kaboom! The detonation did not produce sound in the vacuum, but the visual shockwave was visible from 3 neighboring star systems. A brilliant, emerald supernova bloomed across low Earth orbit, expanding outward in a perfect, razor-sharp ring of pure, unadulterated destructive energy. Inside the epicenter of the blast, Grand Regent Thrag's dense cellular structure dissolved. His smart atoms tore apart under the impossible spiritual heat, his bones turning to glowing dust before every trace of the Emperor Viltrum was permanently erased from the cosmos. In the command bridge of the Imperial Dreadnought Fist of Viltrum, The bridge officers stood in stunned, catatonic silence. The biometrics for Thrag had flatlined. The holographic command link had severed. The Grand Regent, an officer choked out, his hands trembling violently over the helm controls. He's gone, his genetic signature has ceased to exist. Outside the forward observation viewport, the emerald cloud did not fade. It parted. Broly emerged from the nuclear firestorm, floating in the absolute zero vacuum without suit or breather. His golden-green hair whipped like solar flares in the solar wind, his massive chest heaving with rhythmic, godlike power. The lightning dancing across his shoulders had turned violent violet and jade, arcing across the hulls of the surrounding Viltrumite armada. "All ships, converge fire," the surviving Viltrumite fleet commander screamed over the global battlenet. "Open the antimatter projection CANNONS, glass the vector." 50 massive dreadnoughts and 24 surviving Viltrumite shock troopers pivoted in the void. Hundreds of high-yield antimatter cannons, heavy particle lances, and kinetic orbital railguns charged simultaneously, bathing the darkness of space in a blinding crimson targeting crosshair centered on Broly. Broly threw his head back and let out a silent, vacuum-defying roar. He threw his arms wide. Thousands of glowing green Kai orbs, each the size of a warship, materialized in a spherical perimeter around him, forming a colossal, blooming constellation of emerald destruction. Broly thrust his hands forward. Die! The barrage shot outward in an apocalyptic storm of light. Every Viltrumite warship caught in the volley was torn to shreds in S. Awakens, the heavy neutronium hulls crumpled, antimatter reactors ruptured in chain reaction fireballs, and the pride of the Viltrum Empire was reduced to a drifting, burning field of radioactive stardust between Earth and the Moon. The surviving Viltrumite warriors who tried to flee were swallowed whole by the expanding waves of Kai, their bodies disintegrating into raw energy before they could even activate their hyperspace transponders. In less than 3 minutes, the Viltrumite Grand Fleet had ceased to exist. High above the Pacific, the emerald aura slowly dimmed. Broly descended through the atmosphere like a falling star, his boots touching down gently upon the cooled, black basalt of the newly formed ridge overlooking the Owens Valley. The golden-green spikes of his hair settled back down into unruly black locks. The terrifying void in his eyes receded, returning to the deep, silent obsidian of a man who had finally put an end to the hunt. He looked down at his trembling hands, then reached down to touch the coarse green pelt of Ba at his hip. "It is done, Ba," Broly murmured, his voice soft against the mountain wind. "No more cages." 100 miles to the east, hovering nervously above the tree line, Mark Grayson supported his father's paralyzed, bandaged frame. Nolan Grayson, stripped of his imperial delusions and his empire's fleet, stared at the solitary giant on the distant peak. "He destroyed them all, Dad," Mark whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and profound, sobering terror. "Thrag, the fleet, all of it." Nolan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the scarred Saiyan standing quietly beneath the California sun, then closed his eyes in defeat. "Earth does not belong to Viltrum anymore, Mark," Nolan rasped, his voice hollow. "Earth belongs to him, and as long as he breathes, no conqueror will ever dare touch this world again." Across the deep expanse of the cosmos, from the headquarters of the coalition of planets to the darkest corners of the Thraxan Verge, deep space sensors recorded the death of the Viltrumite Empire. The universe had learned a new truth written in blinding emerald fire. Earth was not a prize to be claimed. It was the sanctuary of an unchained god, the legendary Super Saiyan. The afternoon sun of the Sierra Nevada beat down on the newly carved canyon walls, glistening off cooling obsidian flows and sheets of vitrified quartz. High above the scorched earth, the low, mechanical drone of an unarmed GDA transport hummed through the thin mountain air. The matte black craft descended slowly, arresting its drift 50 yards from the ridge where Broly stood. Its side hatch slid open with a sharp pneumatic hiss. Cecil Stedman stepped out onto the metal deployment ramp alone. He wore no combat armor, carried no firearms, and had ordered his security escort to remain grounded in Utah. He walked slowly across the crushed basalt, his polished black dress shoes grinding over the glass shards until he stopped 20 paces from the towering Saiyan. Broly did not turn his head, but his ears twitched at the sound of the footsteps. His dark eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the snow-capped crests of the northern peaks met the pale blue sky. Cecil drew a long breath of the thin, ozone-heavy air, reached into his trench coat, and pulled out an unlit cigar. He flicked a small steel lighter, watching the flame dance against the afternoon glare before taking a slow, steady pull of smoke. "Donald told me I was insane for coming out here without a teleport tether," Cecil said, his gravelly voice calm, steady, and carrying across the quiet ridge. "Told me you could turn this entire mountain range into a gravel pit before my synapses could register the light." Broly stayed silent. The coarse green ear of Ba swayed gently at his hip under the high-altitude breeze. "I watched the orbital feeds," Cecil continued, gesturing with the tip of his glowing cigar toward the upper atmosphere, where faint trails of incinerated Viltrumite debris were still burning up like emerald shooting stars. 50 Viltrumite warships, 30 planetary shock troopers, and Thrag. In 5,000 years of galactic history, nobody ever made that bastard take a step backward. You turned him into cosmic ash in 3 minutes. Broly's chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He wanted to make this place like the others, like my father, like the king. "Well, he won't be making anything ever again," Cecil said. He tapped a small remote on his belt, and the cargo bay doors beneath the GDA transport lowered, revealing 10 massive containers packed with dry survival rations, fresh water bladders, and sides of raw beef. "Every government on this planet knows what happened today. Some of the suits in Washington wanted to try building bigger particle lances. Others wanted to offer you a medal and ask you to join a superhero roster." Cecil let out a short, dry chuckle. "I told them both to shut up. You didn't fight for our flag, and you sure as hell aren't looking for a uniform." Broly finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto the scarred director. There was no rage in his gaze now, only the quiet, heavy exhaustion of a creature that had survived a lifetime of slaughter and wanted nothing more than to be left alone in the wild. "What do you want?" Broly asked, his voice low and gravelly. Cecil tossed his cigar into the ash beneath his boots and crushed it under his heel. "Peace," Cecil said simply. "These mountains belong to you. No satellites, no drones, no tourists or soldiers crossing this perimeter. We'll drop cargo crates of food at the southern pass once a week, no strings attached. In return, if something from the black void out there ever comes down looking to burn our cities, you let yourself off the leash." Broly looked at the food containers, then back toward the wild, untouched expanses of the northern wilderness. "I don't care about your cities," Broly said quietly. "I only protect my peace." "Fair enough," Cecil replied, giving a single nod. "That's more than enough for me." Cecil turned, climbed back up the ramp into the transport, and the hatch sealed with a dull thud. The craft rose on silent thrusters, banking south toward the distant outline of the Pentagon command network, leaving the mountain to its absolute, untouched silence. Broly walked over to the cargo containers, hauled a frozen half-carcass of meat onto his massive shoulder, and began his long, solitary walk toward the deep shadows of the northern canyons. Above him, the sky was clear and vast, free of conquerors, free of empires, and watched over by the undisputed power of the Saiyan legend. "The end,"